I call to order this special meeting of the Township Committee of the Township of Morris for Wednesday, May 26, 2021. The time now is 6:05 p.m. May I please have a roll call?
Recording in progress.
Mr. Dorothy?
Here.
Mr. Mancuso?
Here.
Mr. Ravitz?
Here.
Mrs. Wilson?
Here.
Mayor Grizel?
Recording in progress.
Sorry about that. I am here. Yeah. I usually have a choice to mute it, but I guess not. Thank you very much. Okay. Just have to read the Open Public Meetings Act statement. With both adequate and electronic notice of this meeting has, as required by the Open Public Meetings Act, has been satisfied, and a statement certifying same will be executed. Will everybody please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Yeah. No, to my personal email. Yeah, to the Verizon. Thank you very much. We have one order of business tonight before we get to the redevelopment hearing, and that is two ordinances for introduction that we weren't able to get to at our township meeting last Wednesday, May 19th. So I will call on our municipal attorney, Scott Carlson, to read 18-21 into the record.
Thank you, Mayor. This ordinance 18-21 amends Chapter 57, Land Development, Article 37 of the Code of the Township of Morris.
And is this one going to be done? And Mayor, there's one minor change to that Mr. Slade is going to read into the record prior to the vote for introduction.
All right, very good. So, Mr. Slade, you want to read something into the record?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Scott, I was just opening up my document. Which one did you introduce?
1821, which is the land development article.
The big one?
The big one, yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, so Kathy Wilson, picked up on an issue, and I discussed this with Steve Warner, and I just want to add a sentence to Section 4, Roman numeral 4, stormwater management requirements for major development, specifically under item M. And in that paragraph, it mentions the need for a stormwater access and maintenance agreement. And the second sentence that I want to add would say the stormwater access and maintenance agreement shall be recorded with the Morris County Clerk, and a complete copy of the recorded document shall be provided to the municipality. So that allows it to be recorded with the clerk, obviously, and future owners will be aware of the maintenance requirements.
Thank you, Mr. Slade.
Does that cover it, Committeewoman Wilson?
Yes, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Very good. So will somebody move ordinance 18-21 for introduction, please?
I'll move it.
Second it.
Very good. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Do we need we get a roll call after? So, Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
Mr. Dorothy?
Yes.
Mr. Mancuso?
Yes.
Mr. Ravitz?
Yes.
Mrs. Wilson?
Yes.
Mayor Grizel?
Yes. And this ordinance will be before the Township Committee for adoption, a final hearing and adoption at our regular meeting on June 16th. Mr. Carlson, 1921, please.
Thank you, Mayor. This is an ordinance amending Chapter 57, Land Development.
Very good. And Mr. Quinn, do you want to give a brief statement about 1921?
Yes, sir. It's a, I refer to Mr. Slade, it's a companion ordinance to 18-21.
So this is kind of a second part of the other stormwater ordinance. There's provisions that we added for what would be known as minor development. If someone is increasing impervious coverage greater than 500 square feet, seepage pit design would be required to offset increases in runoff. And that additional language has been added into this ordinance.
Very good. Will somebody move ordinance 1921, please?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Jarfi,
Yes.
Mr. Mancuso,
Yes.
Mr. Ravitz,
Yes.
Mrs. Wilson,
Yes.
Mayor Grizel.
Yes. And now we have resolution 121-21. Mr. Quinn, would you explain that to the public, please?
Yes, sir. This deals with the early bird membership for the pools. As you're aware, unfortunately we had to maintain 50% capacity when we opened up pool registration. Last Friday, we did receive from the New Jersey Department of Health that the restriction capacities for the pools had been lifted. We are then able to open up to the waiting list, and this extends the early bird membership that had expired on May 15th to those on the waiting list, because they had been on the waiting list since prior to May 15th. So they were all notified on Monday morning that they could join, and we are extending this early bird membership fee through Friday.
Very good. And will that clear out the entire waiting list?
Yes, sir. Everyone on the waiting list will have the opportunity to be pool members this year.
Very good. And is there still room to join the pool?
Yes, sir. There is. As of this afternoon, we were up to 1,500 memberships, so we still have quite a few memberships that we can offer.
Very good. So if anybody on the call tonight is interested in a swimming pool membership at the beautiful pools in Morris Township, take a look at our website, morristwp.com. Okay, will somebody move resolution 121-21?
So moved.
I think it's wonderful that we've been able to work this out. All's well that ends well. So I'll offer the resolution.
Very good. Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Very good. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Very good. Thank you. And now we are going to move into the redevelopment, the continuation of the redevelopment hearing of ordinance 01-21. Mr. Carlson, can you read that into the record, please?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. This is an ordinance of the Township of Morris, Morris County, New Jersey, adopting the redevelopment plan for 340 Mount Kemble Avenue regarding the property identified on the township tax maps as block 8101, lot 5, 340 Mount Kemble Avenue, Morris Township, New Jersey, pursuant to the local redevelopment and housing law, being NJSA 40A:12A-1 et sec.
Very good. And before we get into this hearing tonight, I wanted to highlight something that happened at our Township Committee meeting last week. The Legislation Standing Committee has done some great work, and they put forward a package of 7 resolutions, all related to land use, and we passed them at our meeting last week. One of those resolutions related to the redevelopment process, and it came from a suggestion of one of our residents who has been participating in these hearings and emailed us some standards that he had found on the internet. We went ahead and we reviewed those standards. We took them very seriously, and we actually adopted a resolution. I'm going to turn it over to Mark Jorfi, who is on our Standing Committee for Legislation, just to give a little background on this one particular resolution, so that people can understand how we're adapting, both adapting as a governing body, but also the way we listen to our residents and take those comments into consideration. So Mr. Jorfi, please.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, we appreciate the suggestions we get from our residents and our neighbors through email and phones and during the meeting. And we had one that was suggested dealing with drafted guidance from the New Jersey chapter of the American Planning Association. And basically what the idea is, in order to more effectively and involve neighbors in the process of redevelopment, is basically to invite them to the table before a redevelopment plan is drafted and pen is put to paper. So what we did in this resolution is basically codify our policies as a township committee. We codified what we do, what our policies and procedures are moving forward when it comes to redevelopment. And by doing this, we're going to now have public information sessions prior to the introduction of a redevelopment plan. Now, this isn't retroactive, unfortunately. However, we did want to point this out because we want to make sure those who do talk tonight and who email us or call us about certain issues, we do take this seriously and into account. And when something like this comes up and we think it makes sense, we'll act on it. So thank you to all the residents who've contacted us. Moving forward, we will do this a little bit differently for redevelopment plans, and we'll also have baked in, making sure we have 21-day notices. We notice all the neighborhoods in the surrounding area, not just a few households that are near. The information will be put on the municipal messenger. We'll have FAQs before meetings, and we'll always carry a final vote to a subsequent meeting during an initial meeting. So I think what we're doing is really codifying best practices for years down the road and trying to always improve upon the policies we have.
Very good. Thank you very much. And just to be clear, we put forward a package of 7 resolutions, only 2 of which are under our control and 5 of which were suggestions to the state to modify land use policy. But we are going to modify our own redevelopment hearing process in the future. And we also put forward a policy that we're going to post all planning board and board of adjustment plans online before the hearings start, so the public can review plans ahead of time. Did I get that all correct, Mr. Jarvie?
I believe so.
Very good, thank you. And then he also mentioned a couple other good best practices. One is we'd like to expand the notice period from 10 days to 21 days. That is something that we can't control ourselves, but we put that forward to the state. And we also want to expand the 200-foot notice. So usually you only get a notice of a meeting if you're within 200 feet of a property. We are suggesting to double that to 400 feet. So those are the major ones, but they're all community focused, resident focused, and trying to make the process more open and transparent to everybody. So we'll see where the state goes with that. But I wanted to highlight that to the community, really because that one resolution came from a resident of ours from this hearing. So thank you very much. With that said, we are going to resume where we left off last time. We had 6 people in the queue, and we are going to call on them to answer, for them to ask their questions. So the first one I have in the queue is Hank Lamore.
I did not see him on here, sir.
And he's not?
No, sir.
Okay. Then we have a Jack Cox.
Mr. Cox is on.
Mr. Cox. If you're ready to speak, Mr. Cox, is your hand raised?
I just raised my hand.
Very good. We can hear you, Mr. Cox. Thank you very much. Can you give us your name and address for the record, please?
Yes, my name is Jack Cox. I live at 15 Beaver Ridge Road in Morris Plains.
Very good. And you have the option of remaining just on audio, or if you would like to join the meeting via video, you have that option.
I'll do the video.
Okay, very good. So we're going to elevate you to a panelist, and then when you're all done, we'll move you back. Is he on?
Yep.
Very good.
Yes.
You have to unmute yourself, Mr. Cox, now that you're on video.
There we go. I'm on the clock.
Very good. There you go.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. My family moved to Frederick Place in 1964. My dad still lives at 55 Frederick Place. Just as a perspective, at that time, it was probably a cross between the show Happy Days and Wonder Years. It was just a great place. We were all kind of in the same stage of life. It was always crawling with kids. There was a farm on the south side from Frederick Place to New Vernon. There was a farm on the side between Frederick Place and Harder Road, and there was no 287. Along the way came 287, a corporate development behind the odd number houses, which is what we're talking about today. You did bless us with very good neighbors on Darnay Road, Ironwood Road, Aspen Way, and Dogwood Court. But the street and the area has changed significantly. With this new development, expanding this corporate park, Frederick Place is being forced to further surrender its quiet enjoyment. Frankly, we have provided enough development support. let's talk about the hotel for a minute. I think anecdotally, we know at the end of the pandemic that people will be traveling less. This mechanism that we're on right now is going to continue to be a very efficient manner to hold a lot of meetings. We also hear how people will be rotating going into the office. So you're proposing approving a hotel, jamming it into an existing complex with shared parking for people to make fewer business trips because they will, and the people they are making trips to see are probably going to be less frequently in the office. How does this make sense? There's been no study performed. Mr. Phillips seemed comfortable with the idea that it won't get developed if the market is not correct for development of a hotel. I don't think we can be that comfortable with that answer. What is the plan B for this property if a hotel is built and fails? To me, this is not a personal matter with the Township Committee. Frankly, there's two people on this screen right now who attended my mother's wake and funeral in 2018. They've always been supportive to my family. However, this is a bad plan, and it is imposing hardship on a community that has contributed enough. This is an outstanding community, and if it is a bad idea for Frederick Place, it can't be good for the overall township. I yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cox, for those comments. I think a couple of Township Committee members have the same question about what you just raised, about what happens if the hotel turns out not to be viable. So that is an ongoing question on the table that we are going to address as a governing body, I think, towards the end of the meeting when we get to the deliberations. Okay, next on the list, we have Kathleen Mckinnon. Catherine McKinnon, excuse me.
She's on, sir. She can raise her hand.
Ms. McKinnon, if you could raise your hand, then we could recognize you. And I'll just let you know who else I have on the list is it Joan Sartaglia, and G. Kirwan. I'm pronouncing that. And we also have Hank Lamore if he comes on. So those are the people we have in the queue. And then we have the attorney for some of the residents who's also going to be speaking with us this evening. Did we get Catherine McKinnon?
Yes.
Very good. Good evening, Catherine. Could you state your name and address for the record, please?
Catherine McKinnon, 17 Ironwood Road, resident 25 years.
Very good. Would you like to be on audio or moved up to video?
I think audio is fine.
Okay, very good. And I should have reminded everybody who speaks with us tonight that there's a 5-minute speaker's time for each round of questioning. We had promised 3 rounds of questioning, so there'll be plenty of more time to ask your questions, but we ask everybody to limit their comments to 5 minutes so that everybody can have a chance. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, may I just interrupt for a moment? I'm getting reports that people are getting booted off this this meeting, and I just wanted to see if that's a true statement or not.
Well, no.
It's not true, but we also have everybody's on?
Yeah, we have 36 people on, sir.
We have 36 people on, and we don't have a, what's our cap now, 500?
We have 500 as a cap. There are 25 attendees right now, but it would depend on what their situation is because there is a thunderstorm going through right now.
Yeah.
Right,
it could be on their end.
Okay.
But when we started, sir, we had 24 attendees, and now we have 25 attendees, so there's not been a drop. We have not lost anybody.
Yeah.
That were.
And I can hear the thunder, the rain and the wind outside. So just to be clear to those of you who are participating, we do show 25 participants from the public. We have a limit of 500, which got raised after the earlier meeting where we got capped out. So there's no problems on our end as we can see. And so we will move forward. Okay. Sorry, Ms. McKinnon. The floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me a moment. Yes, I would like to underscore just the fact that this is a highly residential area. Now, I'm not just referring to the Frederick, Aspen, Harder Road, Ironwood, Darnay area. but also all the way up and down Mount Kemble. This is a residential area on both sides of the road, all the way pretty much up to Morristown, well south of the office complex down towards Basking Ridge, highly residential area. And it just does not seem appropriate to be putting the hotel, restaurant, or restaurants, I think plural was allowed, so more than one restaurant is allowed, and bars or bars, plural again, potentially more than one bar was allowed for in the plan, in the middle of a residential community. So this neighborhood has residents from infants and strollers, toddlers on tricycles, preschoolers, kids learning to ride their bikes, kids getting on and off the school bus, older couples walking, people jogging, biking, etc. And, you know, the bar in particular is a real safety concern. You know, concern I have is, you know, people will go to happy hour after work, and we don't want then people racing through these residential neighborhoods and residential streets, potentially drunk driving after happy hour, you know, trying to get over to James Street 287 or down Mount Kemble to get on 287. Also, you know, possible traffic backup on Harder Road because of the Mount Kemble Harder Road stoplight. That traffic, when the light goes red, may back up, and then people may choose to turn right on Frederick Place and come speeding down the hill there, because it is downhill and you pick up speed pretty easily. And they may use that as a cut through to cut through on Aspen Road to get over to Harder, to once again get over to James Street for the 287 interchange. Or they may come down Frederick onto Darnay Ironwood and do the same thing. So general concerns about safety and traffic, in particular with the bar and the presence of alcohol in the bar in the residential community. I mean, I would just put it to the township committee. I mean, imagine if the bar was going to be in the middle of your residential neighborhood. You know, would you like that? Maybe you have a son or a grandson who plays baseball. You know, maybe the baseball rolls into the street and he runs out and gets the ball. Maybe he gets hit by a drunk driver that's coming racing down the hill. We ask for your help that won't happen in our neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Next up, we have Joan Sartaglia.
I do not see her, sir. After that is Mr. Kerwin, who I believe is on.
So next is Mr. Kerwin. If you can raise your hand, sir, we'll acknowledge you. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you now. Can you state your name and address for the record, please?
Yes, my name is Jared Kerwin, 35 Frederick Place, resident for just in excess of 10 years.
Very good. Mr. Kerwin, I'm having a hard time hearing you. If you could get closer to your microphone. But I also want to ask, would you prefer to stay on audio or would you like to come on video?
No, I'll stay on audio, even though it's not great. I'll stay on audio.
Okay, very good.
Can you hear me any better?
Yes, that's a little better. Thank you.
Okay. So, so first off, let me just say that my comments were prepared for the last meeting, so haven't really changed much. So if things have changed, I apologize, but I'll stick to the script that I had before. The only change I would have is a point of note that I accept the new best practice you've just mentioned. It'll be great help to both the committee and the township residents, and I thank you for this initiative. But in many of the discussions on the proposed adoption of this development plan, the language from the committee seems to have been very much leaning towards like a done deal. I'm not the only one who felt this. I'm sure others have voiced this opinion. We hear items like the hotel will have, the hotel will be, they can't do, the public can get with the developer when preparing site plan, etc., etc. All of this language gives the impression of a predetermined result, one which has already been decided upon, for what is only a proposal in the system. So it's a concern, coupled with the lack of transparency throughout the early stages of this plan development. It's kind of troubling to a lot of the neighbors. So let's just talk about hotels. And I'll talk on hotels in a different light to the previous gentleman. So as we talk about hotel, I have spent 8 of the last 9 years traveling for corporate travel, up to 5 days per week, and in a lot of cases, multiple weeks at end, and stayed in throughout the States and Canada, I guess in every hotel type you can imagine. And yet, in all of this travel, both within and outside of corporate parks, I kind of struggle to recall ever seeing a hotel built in the backyard of people's homes. In fact, most of the few hotels I've seen with close residential areas were built before, and then the residential properties, the planning for such provided significant layers of buffering, incorporating trees, walls, fencing, etc. So that's one thing I'd like to note. Secondly, on the hotels, having spent many days and nights and weekends, especially in hotels, I can tell you for a fact that hotel operations just don't happen during normal work hours. In a lot of cases, just the opposite, because many deliveries and collections happen pre-dawn to avoid major traffic snarls, thereby bringing after-hour noise and light pollution at some ungodly hours. And I do recall that in my visits to hotels. Additionally, it's been my experience, having spent a number of weekends at hotels, that a lot of maintenance activities tend to take place on weekends while occupancy is at its minimum, which is ideal, I guess, for a hotel manager to do, but that's in a zero residential corporate park, but not if you're practically attached to an established residential area. So saying this could possibly be restricted 9 to 5 operation doesn't kind of give me any warm feeling that would happen, because of what my experience. I won't go into any great detail about the raucous noises from the late night revelers and restaurants, and the noise from outdoor drinking, dining activities, rooftop bars, all of that. But suffice to say that corporate revelers can be as noisy, if not noisier, than anybody else without drink. So that's something, you know, residents are going to have to look forward to if this proposal goes through. As has been touched on already, many corporate travelers will tell you, travel is a major interruption to their lives. When possible, they afford themselves accommodation near or in areas of interest with provisions for walking, sightseeing, shopping, jogging, etc. The proximity to Morristown, a close by, vibrant and welcoming area, is noted in Onyx Manufacturing management marketing materials. As a
Mr. Cohen, you have 1 more minute, sir.
Okay, so irrespective of post-COVID era, I can't honestly believe for one moment that a half-filled hotel in an empty little corporate park will be more exciting than what Morristown has to offer. So the idea of this being perceived for the proposed hotel to keep the corporate park viable is baffling to me. Finally, the current occupied offices across the 350, 360, 412 are close to maxed out and don't need or never have needed a hotel to attract clients. Hotels within our immediate locality are in no way themselves maxed out and would be glad of the additional guests. Also, with respect to the 340 building, it was only recently that we heard a corporate real estate expert tell you yourselves that a building like this will have absolutely no problem getting the additional client on behalf, on the other half of the 340 building. In other words, without the need of a hotel. I won't go into great detail on the lack of privacy in that, but suffice to say that should people go on Google Earth and see what people in this area have done to the houses to provide a stable and safe and private environment for their families, I think provision of a hotel is going to deny them of that. So I have 2 further questions, if I might, very small questions on the plan.
Yeah, so you've had your 5 minutes. We're going to start the second round of questioning shortly. If you could hold those questions, I want to get to a couple of answers. First,
yeah, I can do that.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sorry about that.
Yeah. We have other people that have not been have not done first round yet that have their hands raised.
Okay, so we have a number of people who have their hands raised who did not speak yet in the first round. So I want to get to them. And then we're going to have Mr. Phillips make some comments. I've been jotting down some notes, but let's hear from the next resident. Who are we calling on?
Mr. Gustafson, sir.
Mr. Gustafson. Ken, yes.
Hi, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can you state your name and address for the record?
Yes, Ken Gustafson, 4 Norwood Court.
Very good. And would you like to remain on audio, or would you like to be elevated to video?
We can keep me non-elevated. That's fine. It'll be quicker. So first of all, thanks for the comments and the update on how proceedings like this will be maybe handled a little bit differently in the future. I think that's great as a resident to hear. So thank you to the township for that. My comment is sort of echoing on one of the last comments about a little bit of the sense that this feels like it's a done deal, but more of a nuance to that. My question is if there's an option here, or if this is a binary decision. Is the decision one to accept the plan as is or reject the plan as is? Or does the committee have the option of going back and saying, please adjust some things in the plan? Because something that concerns me, and I don't think I'm alone, is that if the plan is approved as it is, then the developer is certainly well within their rights to do the details of the plan, and anything that's within the outer limits of the plan would be acceptable. And the concern that I have is that although Mr. Phillips has said, well, about certain concerns that were raised in the past, well, it's not typical for a hotel to do this, or a developer might not do that, or a developer usually doesn't do that. That just doesn't really give a lot of confidence. So for things like the size of the property, the capacity of the ballroom, the setback from the property line, hours of operation, windows on the Frederick facing front and things like that. Yeah, we get that maybe they wouldn't do that. But if they're not written into the restrictions of the plan, if I were Onyx, I would say, well, you didn't say I couldn't, I'm going to do it. And so I don't think that gives us the assurance that those things would be satisfactorily hammered out in the next round as the plan advances. So that's my question. Is the committee restricted to either saying, yes, we have to accept it as it is, or can the committee say, go back, we need the following things based on the good input from the township residents to address the following points? That's it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Gustafson. We'll address that in a minute. So let's move on to the next.
The next one, sir, Mr. Ripp had spoken at the last meeting.
Okay, so we'll wait for that second round of comments.
Yes.
Okay.
Rob,
so done.
There's nobody else?
Is there anybody else from the public that has not spoken that wishes to speak at this time? Right. We're going to wait on him.
Okay. And so that's it so far, right?
I have nobody else raising their hand. Sir.
Okay. So before we get to Rob Simon, I am going to turn to Mr. Phillips to make some comments. And I assume that you've taken some notes and I've taken some notes. So Paul, do you want to address some of the things that you've heard, and I'll jump in when necessary?
Sure. I've taken notes. Some of the comments were similar to what was made at the prior meeting, Mayor. I'm happy to address those again, but perhaps if we could start with what you heard and what you'd like me to respond to, that may be the best way to proceed.
Okay, so sure. So from any of the township committee members, if you would like to jump in on any of the points that are about to be made, feel free to do so. I have a note from the first resident. What happens if the hotel fails, if it's not viable? So from a planning perspective, how would you answer that question?
So I think I sort of tried to address this at the prior meeting by saying that no one can entirely predict the future or speculate. And if anyone tells you they can, they're not telling you the truth. So there's two components to this. One is if there's no market for the hotel, and there's been a number of suggestions about doing a market study, study's been done. The market, if there's a market for the hotel, the market will respond. If there's not, the market won't respond. And I stand by the comment that I made at the prior meeting that if there is no market, then there's no harm, no foul, because essentially then the primary purpose of the redevelopment plan was to introduce a hotel to the site, won't get built, at least, in the immediate future. The second part of that question, I think, and the gentleman, Mr. Cox, asked about what's the plan B if the hotel fails. And that's much more difficult to answer because, again, we cannot predict the future. Here's to try and give you some example. When the Onyx first acquired the property, I think I mentioned during some of my introductory remarks, they were looking at a number of options. And one of the options at the time was they were considering whether to even retain and renovate that office building and make the capital expense in that office building. And one of the options was to knock the entire office building down, knock it down, and put up multifamily housing that would have an affordable set aside. If a hotel were to be built and fail, it would be no different than office buildings that I'm aware of in the state, that they aged, the market changed, and in many instances, those office buildings were either retrofitted or they were knocked down to accommodate some type of new development based upon how the market might change in the future. So everything is on the table. I think for the immediate future, the issue is whether there's a market for a hotel, whether it will be, again, assuming the redevelopment plan is adopted, whether it will be built, the safeguards and protections that can be put in place during the time of site plan approval to address many of the concerns that have been raised by the neighbors. But beyond that, Mayor, I don't think any one of us can predict, what's going to happen. And you will cross that bridge when you come to it.
Right. But to take that a step further and just talk about procedurally. So if the hotel were to fail, and after it was built, so we do have a building there, and it were to fail, procedurally, the owner of the building, if it was not going to be a hotel, would then have to come back to the governing body for a change in the agreement, correct? So there would have to be some kind of negotiation with the township, with hearings and such, in order for anything else other than a hotel to be put there.
That is correct, because the way we've structured the redevelopment plan is that there's no opportunity for anyone within this site to go to the zoning board of adjustment for a D use variance, meaning a use that's not authorized under this redevelopment plan. And the uses that are authorized are basically sanctioning the existing office building and providing for the development of a hotel subject to the limitations that are in the plan. So nothing other than that could be done. No one could go to the zoning board of adjustment, and essentially someone would have to approach you, either the existing owner or a future owner, and you would have the control over amending the redevelopment plan to provide for something other than what this plan provides for, office and hotel.
Very good. And again, if the hotel were to fail and another hotel company were to come in and said they wanted to make changes, and if any of those changes did not comply with the redevelopment agreement that we might pass, they again would then have to come before the governing body to seek modifications. Is that correct?
Well, the only caveat, Mayor, is that if someone were to come in and seek modifications that could be done either consistent with the redevelopment plan, or someone could come in and seek relief from the development, meaning the bulk standards in the redevelopment plan, and seek basically a deviation or a variance before the planning board. But any change of use or anything that would rise to the level of a D variance under the municipal land use statute could not go forward without someone coming to the governing body first to amend the redevelopment plan.
Very good. Okay, so I hope that satisfactorily answers that question. I think the answer is that if the hotel happens to fail, there's a lot that the township municipality has control of in terms of what might happen after that. Okay, next question I have is relating to the bar and the concern about happy hour, late night drinking. So we're not sure right now if there's going to be a bar, but that's allowed in the redevelopment plan, correct?
Correct.
Very good. And is that of right to a hotel, or do they have to acquire a liquor license?
If they have more than 100 rooms, they are entitled to get a liquor license from the state.
Okay, so if they have more than, I'm just told if a hotel has more than 100 rooms, they have a right to obtain a liquor license from the state. So they don't have to buy one. Okay, so they will have the opportunity. We don't know until we have more details on the hotel whether there will be a bar. So one question is, can we restrict, not that I'm saying we want to do that, just I'm throwing it out there, can we restrict a bar from the hotel? Are we allowed to do that, or is it a right for a hotel?
It's a right. I don't know the answer to that. I shouldn't say.
Do you know the answer to that, Mr. Phillips?
Perhaps Mr. Carlson does. They have a right to go to ABC.
Paul?
So all I can tell you is that there are certain limitations in the redevelopment plan in terms of seating in a restaurant or lounge or bar area, but beyond that, there's nothing in the redevelopment plan. And I would concur with Mr. Quinn on the 100 rooms are entitled basically under the state statute.
Okay, very good. Then there was a question about sort of the language used in the agreement, and I know there are a couple words like will, shall, should, those kind of qualifier words. Can you sort of comment on how those are used in the agreement?
So in the redevelopment plan, there are certain standards that are indeed fixed, or the word shall is used. So for certain, just by way of example, for certain items such as the setbacks, such as the size limits on meeting rooms and or a banquet room and so forth, that's absolutely fixed in the redevelopment plan. There are certain things where, for example, let's take buffering, and we discussed this at the last meeting. There are certain guidelines with regard to buffering in terms of what can be in the buffer combination of things that can be used to screen the property from adjacent residences, but there's no fixed standards with regard to the type, number, height of plantings. That basically is left to the discretion of the planning board at the time of the site plan hearing, again, assuming this redevelopment plan is adopted. And the board would take into account the applicant, the concerns of the neighbors, and they would basically come to some understanding and agreement with regard to what should or should not be in that buffer area. And I think I tried to explain my logic of that at the last meeting. I will not belabor it. I think some of the issues with the would and maybe is that you can't fix everything in the plan. And I think part of the issue was we were talking about, we tried to spec the hotel to meet the Onyx basic intent that it would be a hotel geared to business travelers. So we did indeed put limits on things such as meeting rooms, the size of the banquet room, because we didn't want it to be an attraction for large event venues such as weddings and other events. So we did put some of those safeguards in place, but that, and there was the issue of whether the restaurant would be a third party operation versus operated by the tenant. And all we can tell you is typically what happens with these kinds of facilities, given the specs. But again, beyond that, Mayor, it's a redevelopment plan, and you can't take into account, every possible question and have an answer, because as we sit here today, there's no concrete user that has stepped up, and we're not at the site plan stage. And again, we base this plan on some concepts of some hotel types that might be considered. And I will also tell you in that regard is that while we have a limit, for example, on the number of rooms here, some of the other prototypes that were basically came before the TCC were for lesser number of rooms. Some had very little meeting space. And I think one or two of the options didn't even have any banquet rooms. So again, knowing what Onyx is looking for here in terms of the orientation toward the business traveler, all we can say is what we can expect. And any prospective user would have to meet the standards in the redevelopment plan. But again, beyond that, we can't, that's why it's the issue of it's likely to be and so forth. But again, some of the standards are indeed fixed.
Okay, and it's a good time to make the point to the community that this is just a redevelopment agreement or redevelopment ordinance, and the site plan is going to go to the planning board, and the planning board is going to have a full review and they're going to apply their standards, and coming out of the planning board, everybody will know exactly what is going to be built there. So this is just the first step in the process. Yes, Committeewoman Wilson.
Yes, thank you. Before we go on to the next question, I have one question about going back to the bars. One of the questions I heard raised was, can there be more than one restaurant and more than one bar? And I'd like to have Mr. Phillips comment on that.
Yes, Kathy, the way the redevelopment plan is worded, there can be, but there is a maximum number of seating. So the short answer is yes, but there are limits in terms of the seating in the restaurant area.
So in other words, there's limits on the seats, but the seats could be divided by two separate restaurants?
Theoretically.
What are the number of seats for the restaurant and for the bar?
The number of seats for the restaurant is the maximum, I think, is 200, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
And that
does that include the bar seats, the 200? If they have bar stools up against the bar, let's say, that counts as a seat, correct?
I'm looking at the language in the plan, Jeff, to make sure that I answer the question correctly. The way it appears in the plan, it would be restaurant, dining area, and large lounge bar areas would not be subject to that cap.
The lounge would not be subject to the cap of 200?
Correct.
Okay. Okay, so that kind of will make me jump ahead to the last question, and we'll come back to one other. The last question you asked about the meets and bounds of the agreement, whether it was we could make changes to it or if it was either a yes or no. So is that something that we could add, a cap to the bar seating?
So the options that you have is to accept the plan. You can reject the plan, or you can make changes to the plan. If the changes are substantive, it would basically have to go back to a first reading.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mr. Mayor, I just have a couple of comments.
Sure. Okay. Let me just ask, sorry, Mr. Travis. Let me just ask the one last question I have, and then let me just open it up to everybody else. So the other question I had from the public was regarding maintenance functions and what might occur during the week and on the weekends. I don't know how much familiarity you have with hotels specifically and the maintenance functions that they require. Do you have that familiarity with what might be occurring outside, other than mowing the lawn?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's meant by maintenance functions.
Okay. Yeah, I was not either, other than mowing the lawn, and all the office parks have to mow the lawn too. I'm not sure when that occurs. But we have, the planning board would have control over, the hours that could happen. Is that correct?
And it's also established by ordinance.
And it's also established by ordinance. They can only happen from
7 a.m.
7 a.m. to 8 p.m.
Correct. 6 p.m. on Saturdays and nothing on Sunday.
6 p.m. on Saturdays and nothing is allowed on Sundays. Commercially. Okay. So that's the ordinance we have on hand, but the planning board could set additional standards, I believe, for those kinds of functions. Is that correct,
Before I forget, Jeff, and I know there are other questions from other members of the committee, but there was a concern raised by, I think, 2 members of the public this evening about the issue of deliveries and hours of delivery. That's something typically that comes up at the time of site plan approval. And certainly the planning board could be in a position as a condition of approval to set hours, limits on hours when there's deliveries, given the concern about noise and so forth during early morning or late evening hours. That's not atypical to basically have that addressed and become a condition of approval.
Yeah, and we did that recently with the Marketplace Mall up on Hanover Avenue, where we restricted the hours for delivery. So very similar to that. So the planning board does have some ability to put in those restrictions. Okay, so Mr. Abbots, sorry for interrupting you there. What's your question, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to comment, and I apologize in advance for my open window and the road noise. If it's bothering, I will keep myself on mute. I just want to thank the residents, for their input. And I specifically wanted to address Mr. Kerwin's and Mr. Gustafson's comment that the language seemed like that this was a done deal. And I want to assure the members of the public that this is not a done deal, not by any stretch. Please don't think that whatsoever. I have a lot of the same questions as to a lot of other the committee members that have been brought up and some that have not even yet to be brought up that we'd like to readdress. So, thank you for addressing your concerns, and I look forward to hearing more from the public. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Very good. Okay. So the only person who has their hand raised right now is Mr. Simon.
And before we get into Mr. Simon's comment, I have one last question.
Sure.
Okay, so in response to the question about what kind of decisions can we make, I know I would like to say that when we worked on the Abbey, we included language in the redevelopment agreement that required the developer to work with the residents to make decisions, for example, on buffer and lighting, et cetera, prior to coming to the site plan and having the planning board decide those things. So I'm assuming that that is something that we could add here. For the benefit of the public, the redevelopment agreement would come after the redevelopment plan if it's passed. If it is, then there's a document called the redevelopment agreement. And if that should happen, I would like to suggest that we put that language in there. And I just want to confirm with Mr. Phillips that that is possible.
Yes, Kathy, it's actually a good point. And using what we did with the Abbey is a good example. And I think that since there were some issues that the Township Committee wanted to have addressed, mostly to afford protections to the neighbors, right? With the understanding that, quite frankly, they didn't want to go through the process again and have another first reading. That what they did is sort of a middle ground is they agreed that the developer would be subject to a redevelopment agreement, and some of these additional items that the Township Committee thought, again, would provide additional protections to the public could be part and parcel of the redevelopment agreement. So that certainly is an additional option that's available to the Township Committee if items come up that you feel have not been appropriately addressed in the redevelopment plan.
Okay, good. That we can all keep that in mind as we proceed with the hearing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Kathy, since you,
Mayor.
Yeah, let me just add, before you start speaking, Peter, let me just make one comment. I just want to make sure that all the residents know that there was an initial meeting held between Onyx and the adjacent members on foot.
Anybody that was contiguous to the 340 Mount Kemble, yes. We had a meeting last week with them.
Okay, so any property that was contiguous with the 340 Mount Kemble property, there was a meeting held last week between the developer, the township, and those particular residents to discuss the buffer and lighting and a number of other issues.
Just buffer and lighting, not discuss the hotel issue.
Yeah, just buffer and lighting. Okay. So those conversations have already started, and I assume they will continue. But thank you for your comment, and we'll use the best practice that we learned from the Abbey to write that into the redevelopment agreement. Okay, sorry, Mr. Mancuso.
Thank you. Just two small thoughts, Mr. Mayor. Number one, yes. I agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Ravitz, and I'm sure with the rest of the committee, that this is as far from a done deal as anything we've ever been associated with. This has a lot of thought process going into it, and believe me, I don't think anybody has gone to the extent of making themselves either on the record or off the record. But the decision-making process is very long and very complicated. And then I would like to ask Mr. Phillips a question. Explain to me again, on the 200 seats for the restaurant, then you said that the lounge is not subject to that restriction. Could you be a little more clear on that, please, sir?
So, Peter, what we did is again, we looked at the three prototypes that we had of potential hotel users just to provide some standards and safeguards. And essentially, some of them only had 50-seat restaurants, but there was, I think, one of the options had 200 seats in dining restaurant areas. I can't recall what they had for bar and lounge. So we put that 200-foot limit in for restaurant dining, but the way we've worded it in the redevelopment plan, that would be exclusive of any bar or lounge area. And I'd have to go back and look at the prototypes to see whether or not that 200 was included or not. But the way the redevelopment plan, Peter, reads now is that would just be for the restaurant dining area, and there were separate bar and lounge. It would not be subject to the 200 seat limit the way the plan is currently drafted.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Okay.
So I think that's a point taken, and I think the governing body will have to address that concern about limitations on the bar. Okay, Mr. Jorphy, do you have anything?
No further questions, Mayor.
Very good. So I think we covered all the township committee members, and we are going to now allow Mr. Simon some time to speak. Mr. Simon, we're going to unmute you, and we will elevate you to be a panelist. Mr. Simon, apparently you have to unmute yourself.
Good evening. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you and see you.
Thank you.
So for the record, can you just state your name and also let us know who you are representing at the hearings?
Of course. So as you hopefully all know, my name is Rob Simon. I'm an attorney with Herald Law in Warren, New Jersey. I'm here on behalf of families and individuals that I've identified. I'll identify them for the record. Michelle and Patrick Larkin, William, which is 6 Norwood Court, William Miller, 19 Zamrock Way, Suman and Lauren Chowdhury, 15 Aspen Way, and Claudia and Ken Gustafson, 4 Norwood Court, all with the address of Morris Township. So with regard to what I intend to do, just to give a little proffer, is that given the number of clients I have, understanding that a couple of them have already taken up a little bit of time, not necessarily 5 minutes, making comments or asking questions, and I do acknowledge that. And I also acknowledging the limitations posed, but considering the fact that the Township Committee is provided in essence for 3 rounds, what I intend to do is as follows, is to ask questions of Mr. Phillips for 20 minutes, which is less than the 25 minutes per client in essence, to be conservative about it, frankly. And that would be the end of this round in essence. And then at the end of the second round, after any neighbors have had an opportunity to use up their, I guess, 5 minutes in the second round, to have Mr. Steck, our professional planner, provide approximately a 20-minute presentation to this Township Committee with regard to the proposed redevelopment plan. And that would constitute our participation on behalf of our clients with regard to this matter. So,
you understand, just so there's clarity for the record and for the public, that this is a redevelopment hearing, not a land use hearing, so that there's the questions really are supposed to be comments. There are, people have posed questions about they want a better understanding of something, but just with the understanding for everybody that this is a redevelopment hearing before the township governing body, and it's not a formal land use hearing that typically happens before the planning board.
Well, Mayor, I'm not talking about what's going on before the planning board. I know all too well under the New Jersey statutes that govern the Open Public Meetings Act, as well as 4812A-1 et sec, which is the redevelopment law, what this process provides for. And this process certainly provides for the opportunity, and in fact, it states it in the statute in a couple of places, the opportunity to ask questions pertaining to this matter. And certainly between the governing body and members of the public, questions have been asked. And certainly what I intend to do is ask questions of Mr. Phillips that I believe are relevant to this process and this township committee's consideration of the redevelopment plan.
Okay. Very good. And we have Mr. Carlson on the line also, who's going to give us counsel from his end on the proceedings. But let's go ahead and we'll give you the floor, Mr. Simon.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Mr. Phillips, good evening. So I have a bunch of questions for you. You can hear me okay? Paul?
Paul, unmute.
I thought we weren't doing Q&A, Scott and Mayor. I thought Mr. Simon can make his comments if he has questions, like any other member of the public. If I can answer them, I will, but this is not a land use proceeding and we're not doing Q&A as I understand it.
This is not a land use proceeding. This is a redevelopment plan public meeting under the Open Public Meetings Act and the redevelopment law. And it states that we have an opportunity to ask questions, just like the members of the public and the Township Committee have asked questions, and there's nothing wrong. I'm not equating this with the planning board proceeding. This is a public hearing on the adoption of a redevelopment plan.
Mr. Simon, if I may, the committee here generously permits some questions to be asked, and those questions are noted as you've seen in the past hearing and this hearing, and the questions will be noted. And when all of your questions and your comments are on the record, Mr. Phillips will no doubt do his best to address them. But
what I'd like to do is ask him, and you and I spoke earlier today, Mr. Carlson, and I told you explicitly what I intended to do this evening. This is not a surprise, and it's fully in compliance with the redevelopment law and the Open Public Meetings Act.
There's nothing in the Open Public Meetings Act that says that says the planner needs to answer your questions one by one. Put your questions on the record. So
is that what you want me to do? You want me to ask 50 questions and you're going to take notes during my 20 minutes?
If you're 50 questions, that's about the way it's going to go. Maybe we'll do them 20 at a time.
So this is on the record, so that you want me to ask one question after the other without any answer, and I'm going to do that for 20 minutes.
Correct. Mr. Simon, I was clear to you that this is not an adversarial proceeding.
It's not an adversarial proceeding. Well, I don't know why it's being made an adversarial proceeding.
No, can I speak, please? This is not an opportunity to cross-examine witnesses. You've seen how we proceeded with every other member of the public, and we're treating you with that same courtesy with additional time.
Mr. Phillips, with all due respect, Mr. Carlson, and members of the Township Committee, Mr. Phillips has prepared a redevelopment plan. He then, at the beginning of this proceeding, testified as to this redevelopment plan. And what I'm asking to do is to question him based on the redevelopment plan and his testimony that has been provided both at the commencement of this proceeding as well as throughout this proceeding in response to questions from members of the public, some excellent questions from members of the public, and excellent questions from Township Committee members. And so based on the combination of that testimony and the redevelopment plan, I want to ask him questions.
Yeah, and you can. First of all, Mr. Simon, you're wasting your own time here. Secondly, We're going to provide you the same courtesies that we provided to every member of the public, which is we are gathering questions and Mr. Phillips is doing his best to address them.
So let me make a suggestion to move this along. So maybe we can have a compromise. Instead of asking questions one by one, Mr. Simon, you have the ability to group your questions, maybe around a certain issue, maybe 5 at a time, and then Paul can make comments on that?
I was not prepared to do anything of the sort, and I don't believe that there's any procedure under the statutes, under the township's ordinances that provide for that. I just want to ask them questions, and I don't really understand why there's such a pushback on being able to ask questions during what's supposed to be a public hearing based on his testimony.
It's a public hearing. It's not a court proceeding. There's no opportunity for cross-examination as you know it in court here.
The statute talks about questions, Mr. Carlson. Are you saying I'm not allowed to if you were saying questions. Okay, well, the record will speak for itself. How would you like me to proceed at this point? Because I'm prepared to ask Mr. Phillips questions, and I was hoping for responses to those questions.
And hopefully you will get them.
Yeah. So, like I suggested, let's start. What are your first questions?
Okay, Mr. Phillips. Onyx has not been appointed as a redeveloper for this redevelopment plan to date, correct?
So,
what are we doing here? I mean, I just want to ask him questions. So basically, what's happened here is that the public has had an opportunity to ask questions. Do you want me just to rattle off 50 questions in 20 minutes? I'll do it. I think that it's really, and Mr. It was, I don't remember who stated, I think it was Mr. Carlson, hit it on the head. It's not an adversarial proceeding, and all of a sudden it's turning into one.
Okay, so Mr. Carlson, what's your suggestion, Mr. Carlson?
Sorry, I was muted. My suggestion is that he put his questions on the record, and perhaps we go 4 or 5 at a time, if he'd like, if that makes this easiest. I very much liked your idea, Mayor, of grouping them around, themes.
Okay.
This is highly improper, and the record will speak for itself, certainly, with regard to this proceeding.
And that's fine.
Okay. So I want to know about Mr. Phillips's interactions with Onyx in terms of whether they've been designated as a redeveloper, whether they've reviewed the redevelopment plan, how many concept plans have they presented? Did they show him prototypes, excuse me? Were any of those plans available to the public? How many meetings he had, how many communications he had with Onyx, both prior to the redevelopment designation and subsequent? So why don't we start there?
So let me ask you, Mr. Simon, just for my own clarification, sure. And no disrespect whatsoever. I just want to understand the relevancy of that group of questions, because we have a document that's before the governing body, and it is what it is. And we just had this conversation about we have to either accept it or reject it, or if there are substantial changes that we want made, we're going to have to reintroduce it. So what's the relevancy to those questions about how many iterations he saw? Isn't it really what's before the governing body right now?
Well, I want to know whether what's before the governing body was the product of the public, the township committee, or this proposed property owner.
Okay, so I can tell you that the governing body did not see this document until just before it was given to the public. We didn't know what was in it until we saw in very late December. I saw a draft, and then I saw it when it was published in January. So as had been discussed earlier, we do have a TCC, a technical coordinating committee. People come in, all developers of all kinds come in and meet with our technical coordinating committee to understand what the metes and bounds of development projects within Morris Township, what will fly, what might need modification, comments from our professionals and such. And there were several rounds of that. But like I said, the township committee was not involved in that. And we have what's before us tonight is the redevelopment agreement, the redevelopment agreement that you have. And as I understand it,
okay, let me ask then: was Mr. Phillips part of the TCC, or did he have any communications with the TCC regarding this property or the redevelopment of this site?
Yeah, the TCC consists of Mr. Phillips, Mr. Slade, who's our engineer, and our other land use attorneys. So Mr. Warner and Mr. Aller.
Right.
Anybody else?
So based on that proffer, Mayor, certainly Mr. Phillips has been involved with this property owner / prospective developer. And that's why I want to ask him questions about it, because redevelopment plan is supposed to be a plan from the community and from the municipality, not proffered by the developer. And that's why I want to ask him questions about that.
Mr. Carlson, can you comment on that it's supposed to be proffered from the community? Because that's not the way the Restoration Hardware property went either. They came to us with a proposal.
And the same with the marketplace.
And same with the marketplace.
Okay. So did they come to you for a proposal prior to the redevelopment designation?
Yes. Both of them did. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And with regard to Mr. Phillips, the site plan approval that was received by Onyx in December of 2017, did you participate in that on behalf of the Board of Adjustment as a planner?
Sorry, I didn't understand that question myself.
The question is that, as we all know, that Onyx received development approvals in 2017 and again in 2020 from the Board of Adjustment relating to substantial renovations to the office building that have now been accomplished. We all know that. My question is whether Mr. Phillips was the Board of Adjustment planner in connection with those applications or participated in any manner on behalf of the Board of Adjustment.
Yes, so Mr. Phillips has been our planner for how many years?
Approximately 10.
He's been our planner for approximately 10 years. So yes, right. you can make that assumption.
Okay, and when you say our planner, that includes the Board of Adjustment as well, correct?
Yes, he's the municipal planner. So he works on the Board of Adjustment, the Planning Board, any redevelopment work that comes before the Township Committee.
Okay. So certainly Mr. Phillips knew that Onyx had plans to fix up the office building before the redevelopment designation in 2019, correct?
Yes.
Right, okay. And the next question is that not only is the office building development likely to be corrected by private effort, but that's precisely what happened here between 2017 and 2020 with regard to the office building, correct? That actually has been fixed up by the private owner, correct?
That is correct, yes.
I don't know, and do we know how much money has been spent to modernize this building since Onyx acquired the building at an auction for $7.6 million?
Well, I know that they paid taxes on it for, 7 years? Well, they've been paying taxes on it since they have acquired it.
Mayor, by the way, you understand that my questions are for Mr. Phillips, and Mr. Phillips is muted for the record, and you're, with all due respect to you, Mayor, that you're responding to questions that I'm asking of Mr. Phillips, which I give you, I guess, credit for trying to deflect, but the record should reflect that these questions are Mr. Phillips based on his testimony that he's been providing in support of this redevelopment plan. So I'd like to have him actually unmute himself and answer some questions. As much as I like both you and Mr. Phillips, at this particular moment, I'd like Mr. Phillips to answer the questions.
So what was that? So that last question was how much money has been spent?
Yeah.
I don't think Mr. Phillips might know that. Mr. Slate, would you know approximately?
I would say continue with the questions and we'll jot them down.
Yeah.
Okay,
we'll try to get an answer to that question.
Okay. I want to know whether Mr. Phillips, in his entire career as a esteemed professional planner, has he ever had a site determined to be in need of redevelopment subsequently spend as much money as this property owner did. I heard $50 million, but I'd like to know the actual number, to improve the site and the building prior to the introduction of an ordinance for a redevelopment plan for a site. That's what I want to know. And I want to know whether Onyx renovating this office building and CIT coming in as a tenant has any bearing on the legitimacy of enacting a redevelopment plan for this property. I also want to know why his redevelopment study and his redevelopment designation, and now his redevelopment plan, did not include the entire office park, only 340 Mount Kemble. And I want to know what is so special about this particular lot and block that distinguishes it from other properties in the office complex for purposes of redevelopment under the redevelopment law, and how it's distinguished from other properties in this office complex for the placement of a large hotel in furtherance of redevelopments, or in other words, why give a hotel to this site and not to any other site in the office complex? That's another question. Another question I have, let's see, is whether the hotel is essential to eliminate the alleged blighted condition that was determined pursuant to the need of redevelopment designation. And where is the evidence that this office building requires a hotel when the office has already been renovated? Other questions as to whether, do you want me to stop and have Mr. Phillips answer them, or I'll just keep going?
That was a good grouping of questions. Do you have any other questions related to that grouping? Because I would allow Mr. Phillips to answer that grouping unless you have additional questions that relate to that.
I don't necessarily group questions, but you can have Mr. Phillips answer that group of questions, please. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So, Paul, can you comment on those last 5 questions I think Mr. Simon asked in a row?
I'm going to try and answer all the questions that he asked to the best of my abilities. Has Onyx been designated a redeveloper? No. Were there interactions with Onyx? Yes. There were a number of meetings at the TCC level. I don't know how many, but there were certainly multiple meetings. I think I testified that in coming up with the redevelopment plan, we did look at some prototypical hotel types. I think as many as 3 that I testified to at the last meeting. Was I the planner for the zoning board during the 2017 approval? Yes. How much investment was made by Onyx? And this is what Onyx represented to me and other representatives of the township. I don't know this is a fact, but they said their investment was somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 million. And I think the additional tenant fit up by the CIT was estimated at about $15 million. But again, that's not coming from me. This is just what was represented to me. Why did the developer spend so much money on the renovation prior to the redevelopment plan? The developer basically did the renovation after the area was designated in need of redevelopment. They proceeded, you'd have to ask the developer why they chose to proceed, but that work was done after the designation was in place. Why only 340 Mount Kemble, not the rest of the office complex? That question's not relevant to this particular matter. I was charged to do a redevelopment study for a single property. I did it. The next phase is to do a redevelopment plan. The question's immaterial to these proceedings. Why the hotel is essential to address the issue of blight. That's also a question that's not relevant. The blight hearing occurred before the renovation took place. We're not going to rehash the reasons why it was determined to be in need of redevelopment. It was designated in need of redevelopment. And the issue of the redevelopment plan doesn't have to be tied to the hotel needing to eliminate the blight. The blight was in place, an affirmative declaration was made by the governing body, and now we're proceeding with a redevelopment plan. So, Mr. Mayor, those are my answers to Mr. Simon's questions.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Phillips. Let me continue. Is there anything, so in your report, in terms of the in need of redevelopment, you raised a lot of issues regarding the property. And have any of those issues that you raised in finding that this area is in need of redevelopment, are any of them actually addressed in the redevelopment plan itself? Because it seems to me that none of them are, that either the issues have been corrected by the developer via approvals they've received, and there isn't anything in the redevelopment plan that addresses the conditions that were stated in the in need of redevelopment designation that led to the that designation. So I want to know about that, because I haven't seen anything in the redevelopment plan that provides for that. I also would like to know specifically that why the redevelopment plan provides for a lower parking ratio than what was recommended in the redevelopment in need of redevelopment study, or even what was approved in 2017 by the Board of Adjustment. So I'd like to know about those things, and that for him to acknowledge that the office building was properly corrected with development approvals or was not addressed in the redevelopment plan. So why don't we stop there, and I'll look at those questions.
Okay.
And have him answer those. Those
Sure.
are grouped together.
Okay. So Paul, do you have answers for that?
Paul, you're muted.
Unmute.
Paul, if you're muted.
Paul, unmute.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, but I think if we're going to go down this road, we should get a bunch of questions at once. But, well, Mayor, whatever you think.
Okay. I just asked three together.
I asked the mayor, so. Rob. Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I apologize, Paul.
That's okay. Yeah. So go ahead. You're unmuted. So let's go ahead and answer this small group of questions.
So the issue with regard to the developer, after the property was designated in need of redevelopment, the developer made a decision to proceed with the renovation of the office building. He made that decision. There was an affirmative declaration. For a variety of reasons, the redevelopment plan took time, not the least of which was COVID, because it was probably ready to go in March of 2020. And he proceeded to renovate the office building. That does not have any effect, in my opinion, on basically coming up with a redevelopment plan for a hotel. The fact that as we sit here today, the building is largely renovated, that does not basically compromise your ability to do a plan to include a hotel. The second question was the lower parking ratio. So I'm doing this as best as I recall. The parking ratio that we have in the redevelopment plan for office is the same as we have in our zoning ordinance. The developer chose to increase the parking supply above and beyond what the minimum office parking requirement is, because at the time, and then this is all pre-COVID, the trends in the office market with open floor plans was there's less space per employee, so there was more parking than the 4 per thousand, and they did that. In the redevelopment plan, we kept the 4 per thousand as a minimum. We added hotel standards, and we made certain provisions for shared parking. The whole issue of parking would obviously, if this plan gets approved, will be played out at the site plan stage.
And Paul, with regard to the site plan stage,
hold on 1 second, Rob.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, Mr. Simon, I'm sorry. So we had extensive conversations about the parking and the shared parking situation that the hotel is going to require. I don't know if you're going to start questioning about shared parking and
I am not, Mr. Mayor. I'm not.
Oh,
I know
okay.
we talked about that the last time, and I don't want to go through areas that we've already discussed.
Okay, very good. Okay. Because, just so the public understands, the shared parking concept is a concern of mine. And as a reminder, both myself and Committeewoman Wilson do sit on the planning board. So any agreements, and I would just want to remind the public of this in general, anything that happens before this governing body, you have my promise, and I am no doubt Committeewoman Wilson promises that we are going to take everything that we hear from these proceedings and bring them to the planning board. So it's not like it's going to leave our hands and all of a sudden it's in somebody else's hands. There is some overlap between this governing body and the planning board. And I want, if that provides any level of reinsurance for the public, I just wanted to let them know. Okay, Mr. Simon, go ahead.
I'm going to ask one question on that, and for Mr. Phillips. Mr. Phillips, if the developer brings in a fully conforming plan, fully 100% conforming, pursuant to the words that are contained in the redevelopment plan, the planning board has a legal obligation to approve that site plan, correct?
Okay.
I'm not gonna play the game.
Yeah.
One question.
Is that his last question?
I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure that that's so. I don't. I'm not going to say. As a member of the planning board, I am not going to say that we are going to approve anything as of whatever's of right in the redevelopment plan. It's still got to go through the process, and the planning board is going to weigh in.
I understand. I understand you have to go before the planning board. That was a question from Mr. Phillips. I think well, I'd like him to answer it, but I guess my other questions are whether it doesn't appear, Mr. Phillips, that the master plan recommends a hotel for this property or within this area of town. Is that correct?
Let's ask a group member questions, Mr. Simon.
All right. I mean, it's a little difficult, but I'll try. And I'm assuming that he would acknowledge that a hotel use is not a permitted use in any part of Morris Township. It may be a conditional use in certain areas, but it's not an actual permitted use as being proposed here. And he had also made a comment about a trend to go to mixed use development. And I'd like him to identify where he's seen in Morris County a trend to go to mixed use development that includes an office and a hotel use. So that's a group of questions.
We can have more.
Okay. What are your next group of questions?
Well, my next group of questions is whether he's aware of the vacancy rates for 340 Mount Kemble, 412 Mount Kemble, 350, 36 Mount Kemble. Is he aware of any of that information?
Okay, so Paul, let's address the questions for the what's in our master plan.
So the master plan does not make a specific recommendation for a hotel on the site, but when we did our re-examination several years back, we were certainly cognizant of the trend, what was occurring and continues to occur in New Jersey, in that many of the office campuses were basically having a hard time finding new tenants. Corporations were leaving. They couldn't find replacement office users, and that there was a trend to consider potentially mixed-use development, which might include things such as a hotel and or residential or some combination of the above. And we did note that in the master plan, and I think two separate references in the master plan, and I think the references are in the redevelopment plan itself that we're considering this evening. And I'm paraphrasing, but the recommendation was, as opportunities present themselves, basically the township should be in a position to be proactive along those lines. And essentially, in this case, we had a office building that had been vacated by AT&T for some years, and the township was approached by the owner that purchased this property. And as I mentioned on several occasions, that owner was considering a variety of mixed use options. And basically what we ended up here was the retention and refurbishing of the office building with the addition of a hotel. The next question was the permitted uses for a hotel. I think the only zone that allows it conditionally is OL5, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not aware of the particular vacancy rates in this office park as we sit here. And for office hotels in Morris County, I would tell you that the Green at Florham Park added provision for a hotel. And there's an office complex there, which includes Summit Medical Group as well as BASF. That was part of a rezoning of the former Exxon campus. I think Archer is the hotel that actually built there. I know that in Giralda Farms in Madison, a hotel hasn't been built, but I know they changed their zoning several years back to add hotel, I think, as a conditional use. There are other examples. I know it's not Morris County, but the Livingston Mall basically changed their zoning several years back. That's retail, not office, but they changed their zoning to allow for a hotel along a portion of the frontage of that property. I know that, and this is Essex County, I know that in Milburn, they did a mixed use rezoning to include a hotel and housing on an office site on JFK Parkway. There are probably more, but these examples come to mind.
Right. And with regard to particularly the Florham Park one, you talked about the Archer Hotel. How many rooms is that? Do you know?
Let's continue with your questions. I'm not sure. This is Morris Township. This is not Florham Park.
Okay, thank you. And so, and Paul, you don't know in terms of not only the vacancy rates, but you're not aware, I'm assuming, of what is being offered by the subject site or any of the surrounding office park sites in terms of the rent per square feet for the renting of any of that office space. I'm assuming that that's the case. I also want to know whether he is aware of any studies pertaining to the interest in having a hotel alongside a office complex like this one, and whether there's studies determining that commercial tenants would be more likely to rent office space or be able to charge higher rents if there's a full service hotel with a bar and a restaurant as compared to if there wasn't a hotel. And I want to know what the actual market demand for the hotel is at this location and what he's basing that on.
And I can tell you that the Township Committee also has those same concerns. We want to know what the market demand is for a hotel to ensure that one is viable. And that is something that our Township Committee is seeking answers to. I don't think that Paul has those answers either, because I know that I don't. So it's something that the Township Committee is going to be, it is going to be part of our deliberations. And it's one data point that I know that I need. And I know Paul doesn't have it. So we are looking for that.
Yeah, I mean, and similar, Mayor, the issue of, vacancy rates at surrounding hotels, what hotel, room capacity is, the rental rate, the room rate, occupancy and vacancy rates at surrounding hotels. I mean, I can, obviously list them, but you all know them, whether it's the Best Western, the Westin, the Hyatt Regency, the Old Mill Inn, the Madison Hotel, the Archer Hotel in Florham Park. We don't have any of that information. And similarly, I'm curious as to whether there's information as to a demand for a new restaurant in the area, a new bar in the area, especially given what's going on regarding not only oversaturation of restaurants, but more importantly, allowing these restaurants and bars and hotels to survive, post-pandemic. And, and that's I know it's a real concern for many clients of mine. And, certainly, that's why I wanted to ask Mr. Phillips about that, as well as the fact that with regard to the redevelopment plan itself, that the Onyx approvals appear to be intended to become the ordinance standard, yet they're not codified anywhere in the ordinance. But by putting those approvals into the redevelopment plan, you're also, of course, extending the period of approvals, and in the fact that the redevelopment plan essentially does not require any renovation of the office building. I'd just like to get confirmation of that from Mr. Phillips.
So can you repeat that last part just so I have a full understanding, please?
Sure. I'm sorry, Mayor. So basically, the way the redevelopment plan reads, and you have it in front of you, it states that there's been these other approvals, which we all know about in 2017 and basically last summer, which led to renovation of these offices. And basically, we're saying as part of this redevelopment plan that the developer needs to quote unquote comply with those approvals, which of course they already have done, and they've already effectuated those approvals with development. So there's nothing in the redevelopment plan that requires any renovation of the office building. And I just want to get confirmation on that. And then I have a follow-up question on that.
Okay. So it's a good question. Does the redevelopment plan include, Paul, a requirement to redevelop the rest of the office building?
So the plan, I would characterize the plan recognizes the approvals, the 3 approvals that have been granted to that property over the last, whatever it is, 3 or 4 years. However, and those approvals obviously were largely for the renovation of the office building. So that's recognized, but there are separate standards governing future development. For example, there's a cap on the floor area that's meant to mirror the existing office building without allowing for expansion. There are coverage requirements, parking requirements, and so forth going forward. But there's no specific requirement other than recognizing those approvals that the office building be renovated.
So then I guess my follow-up question, Paul, on that is, and you're very seasoned and you've been doing this for a very long time. And you've certainly authored, to my knowledge, a number of redevelopment plans. And my question then is, have you ever authored a redevelopment plan where you did precisely what you did here? Namely, taking the area that was quote unquote in need of redevelopment or blighted, and basically in the redevelopment plan say that it's to be basically developed per the approvals secured by the developer, both 2 years prior and subsequent to the redevelopment designation, without any other requirements.
Okay, so without getting into a back and forth questioning, I understand that question, and I think Paul does as well. So let's move on to your next group of questions and let him have him answer.
Okay, I'll hopefully he'll answer that question.
Yes, we'll make sure he answers that.
Right. So specifically with regard to, and let me just get into.
Let me answer it now, and I really think this would move further if we can group the questions. I'll be responsive and answer every question to the best of my abilities. But the answer to that question is no. I've never had anything exactly comparable to this, and the reason is that there was this lag between the designation and basically the redevelopment plan, and the property owner here decided to proceed with the renovation of the office building. So that at the time we were drafting the redevelopment plan, we had the benefit not only of the approvals that are cited in the redevelopment plan, but as we all know, as we sit here tonight, considering whether or not to adopt this redevelopment plan, that basically those approvals in the renovation of the building has been perfected. Is it unusual? Yes, it is.
And let me get to the plan itself. And we're talking about, in terms of accessory uses, Paul, it references in the plan a banquet room. And I guess my question is, and it has to do with accessory uses and the intensity or the impact of this proposed development for the hotel. And my question in my head is, what's the difference between a banquet room and a ballroom? And where does it say that there's not going to be any weddings or bar mitzvahs or other, celebrations? And also with regard to accessory uses, certainly it talks about that any other uses which are subordinate and customarily incidental to a hotel. So my question then is, does that include a retail shop or any other accessory uses that may take place in the future? That includes outdoor uses potentially. And so I have questions about the language and the possibilities in terms of the hotel use, particularly with regard to the banquet space. We all know we go to seminars all the time at hotels, and this would be an example of a hotel that maybe is going to host, corporate business events as part of, an all-day seminar. And I'm curious as to whether what the, potential is for that intensity of use, especially given the language in the redevelopment.
Okay, so a number of people have asked that question already, and I think we've discussed that previously, and Paul will address that. So let me ask you to move on, and let me ask how many more questions do you have?
I probably have 15 more questions, but I'll try to group them.
Okay, so let's try to group them and move it along, because we've been at this with all due respect quite a while now, and we have other residents who have their hands raised. So let's continue with your question, try to group them as much as possible, and we'll have Paul come back and answer them.
Sure. So I already talked about the outdoor use. So let me talk about the buffer. And there's no minimum buffer width or depth or any requirement that any existing buffer be placed in a conservation easement. That is certainly the case with other ordinances with uses and development adjacent to residential homes. And I guess my question is that you're not going to need the buffer just for the renovation of the office. And it wasn't certainly required by the Board of Adjustment approvals, but rather the buffer is required because we now have a proposed 24/7 hotel that's located close to residential properties. And so I just want to get some acknowledgement with regard to that.
Yeah, so I can tell you that the prior approval for the office building did not require any buffering. All right, so we had discussed that already too, and that one of the benefits of this redevelopment plan was that we are actually allowed to require a buffering that was previously unrequired. So it is a benefit in that respect to the residents that there will be a buffer added. I can tell you that I think the entire Township Committee wants to have a better understanding of what that buffer is going to be, that we're not satisfied with just a generic buffer. We'd like to hear from the applicant what might be proposed for that buffer to give us some more confidence that our residents are going to be adequately buffered. So we have some of those same questions as well.
Okay. All right. Well, you know what, Mayor, Mr. Phillips, I think at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop. And I think I have other questions certainly, but I think that I'm going to hold off and let the other residents who you say have hands raised, et cetera, and then have Mr. Steck certainly address some of these issues, certainly, at the end of round two. So thank you. And I appreciate both Mr. Phillips, Mayor, Township Committee, professionals. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
And Mr. Simon, let me say this, like we started off, this is not meant to be adversarial. We want to hear from our residents, and I totally understand that you are representative of them. You're an extension of them. And I personally appreciate all the questions you raised. You gave us a lot of things that we need to think about. A lot of the questions you raised haven't been answered yet. And Township, the governing body, is actually looking for the same answers to some of the questions that you posed. We're not trying to avoid answering some of those questions, but believe me, they have to be answered by the end of this hearing to give the governing body the confidence that we can move forward.
Well, absolutely. And I will tell you, Mayor, having done this many, many times, wearing a lot of different hats, including a municipal hat, that you want to get it right. And, Mr. Carlson's correct. It is not an adversarial proceeding. It's not intended to be. It's to try to get all the information and then make a determination that is in the interests of the public and the township. And that's why we are, and I apologize, if I, certainly got a little excited, but the reality is that it's because we care, and we care greatly to make sure that every consideration is given to what is being proposed and is in front of the Township Committee. So I sincerely appreciate and thank you for your time.
Very good. Thank you for those thoughts. And we are on the same page with regard to doing what's right for our community. Okay, so we are going to move into a second round of questioning. Does anybody here in the room need a bathroom break? Yes? Yes. Sorry, we have a bunch of older men here. I think we all need a bathroom break. I'm sorry. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. What time is it?
It's 7:51.
7:51.
7:51. Okay, so what's reasonable? 8 o'clock? 5 minutes? Just a quick 5 minutes? Sure. We'll try to take a quick 5 minutes, okay? So just if you're on Zoom, just hold on for a second and we'll be back. Thank you very much. Jim?
I don't see Peter back.
You look like you need a cup of coffee.
No, I'm all right.
I just got a cup of coffee.
It smells good though.
I'm on? Okay.
I don't see Mr. Mancuso on, sir.
Okay, so we're just waiting for our board to come back online. We don't see Mr. Mancuso. Where are all my... So I see Mr. Ravitz. I see Committeewoman Wilson. We're just waiting for Mr. Mancuso. Ms. McDonald, are you back online? I know your box is there. Dawn, are you back online? Can you unmute yourself for a second? Okay, so Peter's back in his seat? Okay, very good. So we're going to call the meeting back to order. Just for the record, I did want to take a roll call. If the clerk is there, she can do that. If not, I'll ask Mr. Quinn to do that. Tim, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Mr. Ravitz.
Mr. Ravitz, you present?
He's present.
I'm present.
Yep. Thank you, sir. Mr. Mancuso.
Here.
Mrs. Wilson. Mr. Reyes, I see you.
Here.
Mr. Jorfi.
Here.
Mr. Grisel.
Here.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. So we're going to now continue with the second round of questioning. We promised the public that we would have 3 rounds of questioning, and this is the beginning of the second round. So any questions? I know Mr. Kerwin didn't have a chance to finish his questioning. If Mr. Kerwin wants to come back online.
Rosemary Gilmartin, first up.
Rosemary Gilmartin's the first up. Very good. Mrs. Gilmartin, can you hear me? We can't hear you yet. Can you unmute yourself?
Oh, you are.
Rosemary?
Yep, there you go.
Very good. We can hear you now. Can you state your name and address for the record, please?
Sure. I was the last person to sign up, so I'm surprised I'm first, but okay. Rosemary Gilmartin, 37 Frederick Place.
Very good. And would you like to stay on audio or would you like to be elevated to video?
Just audio is fine.
Very good.
Simple. I just have, it's kind of a 2-part question. Can the board approve a redevelopment plan, but remove the permission for a hotel at this time? So that if years down the road, a different owner decided that was something they wanted, not to say they're going to get it, but they could reapply. The other question, part of that question is, since they keep talking over and over and over again about all they want is a really small little hotel that is only going to be used primarily for the people in the office buildings and a small restaurant. If you go with a hotel, why don't you just make those the parameters? You don't need a 4-story hotel if it's going to be. You could make the hotel much smaller, and it's definitely only geared to what they're saying they want, as compared to geared to potentially having the capacity to be a Marriott. Because that's saying we don't want that, we only want this, but while you're at it, why don't you go ahead and give us permission to do it? So that's my question.
Okay, your first question was, can we exclude the hotel completely from the redevelopment plan?
Let's just say that that was put in initially, if it was my understanding, that the reason that hotel even came up was because it was considered a relatively unrentable, blighted area. It's not unrentable. It's no longer blighted. They've finished half the building. The other buildings on the other parts are doing extremely well. So you really kind of lose that argument that you have to have a hotel. So can you just delete that from the redevelopment plan? Delete the hotel. Then they don't have a problem with parking or anything. and just go forward with the redevelopment plan, but no hotel? Or do you have to start all over again?
Okay, very good. Thanks. We'll have Mr. Phillips answer those a group of questions as we've been doing.
Yep,
so
no problem.
Thank you for those questions.
Mr. Goldberg.
Mr. Goldberg, please unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening. Lee Goldberg, 10 Arrowhead Road.
Good evening, Mr. Goldberg. Would you like to stay on audio or would you like to be elevated to video?
Audio is fine. Thank you for asking those.
Okay, good. Can you speak up just a little bit? Thank you.
Sure. Am I coming through?
Yes.
Audibly?
Very good.
Okay.
We got
good.
you now. Yes, that's better.
Okay. My question is maybe perhaps best for Mr. Phillips. On page 15 of the redevelopment plan, there's a section that talks to relationship to master plans of adjacent municipalities. And in that section, it's reported that, Harding references from their master plan inconsistencies in the zoning back there between the township and Harding, and knowing of the potentiality and plan for Harding to potentially locate residential units back there and potentially gain access through a road through Morris Township. Just want to know what the impact, how does this redevelopment plan, is any of that activity, should it come to fruition, impactful on this redevelopment plan? And if you could also speak to the inconsistencies between the zoning between the two towns.
So I just want to make sure I have your questions right. Was there just that one question about the issue with the Harding development, or were you asking a question about, you made a statement about Harding saying in their plan that something was inconsistent?
Well, yeah, so on page 15 of the redevelopment plan, there's a section that speaks to the relationship to master plans of adjacent municipalities. And published in this redevelopment plan, it's calling out that within the Harding master plan, it's pointing out the inconsistencies in the zoning between the two towns. So any elaboration between what that inconsistency is, or we understand it to be, and is there, and so that's the first question. And then anything that in generally that potential future use of those 40 acres back there, how that would be either taken into account by this redevelopment plan or any impact at all, or maybe it's completely outside of the scope of it and doesn't impact it or touch it at all.
Okay. We got it. Thank you, Mr. Goldberg. We're going to take one more resident and then maybe we'll answer the group questions.
Go to Mr. Kerwin, sir.
Mr. Kerwin?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Kerwin?
Hi, this is Nancy Lennon, actually.
Oh, hello, Mrs. Lennon.
Yes, so I have...
sorry, Nancy, for the record, can you state your name and address?
Yes, it's 35 Frederick Place, Morris Township.
Very good. Good evening.
Good evening. I have a session about the ballroom banquet. Mm-hmm. I don't understand the distinction between the two. And I also see in the plan, it says, well, the FAQ said that the hotel would not serve as an entertainment venue for revenue purposes. Now, I don't see where that was mentioned in the redevelopment plan. So if someone can explain to me, first of all, what entertainment venue for revenue purposes means and impacts the hotel. And then my next question is on page 23 of the redevelopment plan, it mentions the possibility of subdividing that lot so that Onyx actually sell the hotel portion of it. So I'm wondering, what does that do with the shared parking that's required for the hotel to go through?
Okay. Those are good questions. Okay, so I like that grouping of questions. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Phillips to answer what's been posed by the last three residents.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
So Ms. Gilmartin raised the issue of, can the Township Committee approve the redevelopment plan without the hotel? So in essence, if the Township Committee were predisposed to not approving the hotel, there would be no need to do a redevelopment plan, in my opinion. The redevelopment plan is set up to allow the hotel, basically in combination with the existing office building, and as is basically in terms of the configuration and floor area. So if the township committee were predisposed to not wanting to go forward with the hotel, my recommendation would be not to approve the redevelopment plan and just fall back to the underlying OL 40 zoning. Without the hotel, the redevelopment plan to me makes little sense. The second question, there was questions about why allow, I think, a 4-story hotel or what the redevelopment plan allows. Again, as I've indicated, when we were basically crafting the redevelopment plan language and putting in the regulatory limits on the hotel, we were working off a number of potential prototypes that was shared with us by Onyx. And essentially, as I mentioned, as I recall, they ranged in the number of rooms, the amount of meeting space, and so forth. We basically put in those parameters based on those prototypes, including a 4-story prototype. And my recollection was all the prototypes were 4 stories. So I think the issue is, if you're going to allow a hotel on that site, you have to be kind of responsive to what the market wants to do. And the market wants to build basically 4 stories, not 2 stories. So again, I think this really goes to the question of, whether or not you want to, or think it's appropriate to allow the hotel to begin with. If you do, these are kind of the logical parameters that make sense from a market standpoint. Mr. Goldberg brought up
sorry, Paul, just for clarification on that last point. The redevelopment plan states sort of the maximum meets and bounds for a hotel, but it's possible that a smaller hotel could come in. We're just saying the max is 225 rooms. We might get a proposal for 180 rooms, for example.
And as a matter of fact, I think, as I mentioned on a couple of occasions, when we came up with the parameters, we looked at sort of we tied it to the most permissive in terms of the one prototype that had the largest number of rooms. And I think it also had the largest amount of meeting and banquet space, and we used that as the limits. But Jeff, just to give you some order of magnitude, I think the one prototype was 224 rooms. Another one was in the 160s, and another one was in the 150s. And in fact, I think in 2 of the other instances, there wasn't even a banquet or room, and there was minimal meeting rooms. So again, we basically use sort of the most permissive of the prototypes to put in the redevelopment plan. But you're correct. There were different options, and it is possible that someone can build less than what the redevelopment plan would allow.
Okay, very good. So continue on with the rest of
the Mr. Goldberg mentioned that I think page 15 of the redevelopment plan, which is relationship to adjacent municipalities, and he specifically mentioned Harding Township. And this is basically pretty much boilerplate that goes into a redevelopment plan, and it's mostly for informational purposes. But I think what he's referencing is that the Harding relatively recently rezoned lands along the Morris Township border for a 96-unit inclusionary housing project, meaning that there's a set aside of affordable units, a combination of market rate and affordable. And he talked about the issue of compatibility with this redevelopment plan. What I would respond in that regard is that residential use is not contemplated as part of either this redevelopment plan, or it's not contemplated within the larger OL 40 district, where you have several other office buildings nearby, including 350 and 360 Mount Kemble, and I think 412 Mount Kemble. So he's correct in that regard. That doesn't directly affect the redevelopment plan per se, because this property is kind of separate and apart from the referenced property that's part of the new inclusionary zone in Harding Township. I guess Ms. Lennon brought up two issues. Let me deal with the easier one first, I think, about the subdivision of the lot. Yes, it's intended that if for some reason there was an arrangement with a prospective hotel user where the lot would be subdivided, would allow for that lot to be owned by that user. I mean, there's potentially other arrangements where it could be leased. But the issue of the parking and making sure there's adequate parking, if indeed there is a subdivision, it would have to go before the planning board as per the redevelopment plan. And if there is shared parking, there would undoubtedly be, as part of a condition of the planning board's approval, cross-access and parking arrangements or an agreement between the two lots. And that would likely be a condition of the planning board approval to make sure that obviously there's adequate parking as part of a shared parking arrangement on the office lot to service the hotel. These kinds of arrangements are not uncommon as part of larger mixed-use developments, whether it be by conventional zoning or by a redevelopment plan. With regard to the, and I think Mr. Simon raised this issue as well, the banquet room versus the ballroom. This is interesting. There's some kind of nuances to what's a banquet room and what's a ballroom. And let me kind of, as best I can, kind of address that. So if you look at actually a ballroom and a definitions of ballroom, they usually will note a large room, and they also relate that there's dancing involved in a ballroom. So weddings and other receptions where there's dancing typically takes place in a ballroom. There's also some references out there, not in this redevelopment plan, to a banquet hall. And a banquet hall is also sort of similar to a ballroom, and it's kind of an event venue for weddings and so forth. We've provided in this plan for one banquet room, a single banquet room. And if you look at a definition of a banquet, I think it comes up something like a celebratory meal. So the intent here is, yes, there would be provision depending upon the specific hotel user and their needs, but they would be permitted to do one banquet room, which would be available typically for a business luncheon or breakfast or so forth. There's a limit on the size of that one banquet room, but there's no specific provision that there be no weddings in the banquet room. Although that's unlikely, I will acknowledge there is no specific provision. And as I mentioned before, and two of the other three prototypes had no banquet room at all as part of their development program. So I hope I've sort of answered that as best I can. With regard to the FAQ, I believe that the reference to the entertainment venue kind of related back to sort of weddings and large scale events, which again are not intended here given the one room and the limit on the room, but there's no specific provision that there would be no weddings here.
There's no specific provision in the redevelopment plan.
Correct.
Yeah, so that leads me to a question, and I think maybe Mr. Carlson would answer this. But we did publish this FAQ, which is of the record, right? We make statements in the FAQ. We make assertions, and some of which are not included in the redevelopment plan, just like the weddings. The FAQ, correct? Mark says that there's no weddings, right? The FAQ you put together.
I'd have to go back and read verbatim.
I don't think it's that specific.
No, it doesn't say. I'll double check for you. Okay, the FAQ said something about parties.
I think it just says
banquet
service and entertainment venue.
Will not serve as an entertainment venue. Okay, so be that as it may, whatever the exact wording is, Mr. Carlson, are you there?
I'm here.
So when we make a statement in FAQ, such as it will not be an entertainment venue, but that wording is not in the redevelopment plan, but the FAQ is of record from the municipality, How does that work?
It's a tough question, Mayor. It's certainly part of the legislative record. And if there were ever an inquiry into what the legislative intent was, that would speak volumes on that issue. But it's questionable whether or not at the planning board level or at any kind of an enforcement level, that provision could be enforced. I mean, an FAQ is simply not an enforceable document.
Right. So that leads me.
I can give you the language.
Oh, sure. So Mr. Quinn has the language for us.
There will not be any large meeting rooms.
Speaking to the mic.
There will not be any large meeting rooms or ballroom facilities.
Okay.
The proposed hotel would not serve as an entertainment venue for revenue purposes, but rather have meeting rooms, small banquet rooms, and a restaurant and bar for guests access to dining without traveling outside of the office complex. Ballrooms are prohibited in the redevelopment plan.
So, Mr. Carlson, since that is of record from the municipality, is the planning board required to take that into consideration?
I can tell you could probably write a 20-page memo on that question. It's I've been doing this for well over a decade, and I've never had a question like that. So
yeah. So and that is because you've likely not seen a municipality like Morris Township that actually publishes such an extensive FAQ.
That's correct. Normally, I don't think I've ever seen an FAQ like yours, and perhaps none at all,
right.
With respect to a redevelopment plan.
Yeah. So the municipality did try to go a little bit above and beyond by publishing that additional amount of information to give some assurances to the public. So let me ask this, because it probably doesn't make people feel good that, the FAQ is out there, but we can't really enforce it. The fact that myself and Committeewoman Wilson also sit on the planning board, and I mentioned this before, it's my personal intent, and I'm 100% sure hers as well, that we will take. I'm very cognizant of the spirit of documents as opposed to the letter of the law. I'm very cognizant of the spirit of things. And is that enough of an assurance that Kathy and I will take that back to the planning board, or do we need more assurance for the public?
I'm not the planning board attorney, but it sounds like what you will be asking the planning board to do is to put that language in any approval as a condition of approval. You might want to seek that in any redevelopment agreement as well. That's one document that we do control, and we could make part of this if this plan were to be approved.
Right, redevelopment agreement.
Right. That's what Mr. Quinn is agreeing with you too. That some of these details would go in a redevelopment agreement, and the redevelopment agreement is under the control of the municipality.
Right, and knowing how important this issue is, I think to all the committee members, I for one am fairly confident that would be required in a redevelopment agreement by this committee.
Right, and looking back to the restoration hardware redevelopment agreement, that is where we put in the specifics of what the buffer was going to be. Correct.
Correct.
That occurred in the redevelopment agreement, not in the redevelopment plan. So there is right. So there are these intervening steps just to reinforce with the public. This is the plan stage. Then there's an agreement where we work out some specifics, and there's a redevelopment agreement with the developer that gets hashed out, and then the site plan gets prepared, and that site plan is going to go before the TCC because right now they've had a first look at a couple concept plans, but it'll go before the TCC before it even gets to the planning board. So there's a lot of intervening steps to make sure that we get this right. We've had just quite a discussion here. I just want to turn to the fellow committee people. Does anybody have a comment or question? And maybe Mrs. Wilson, can I put you on the spot, with regard to what I said about, taking what we've heard here, you and I, and you can put it on the record how you're going to, treat this at the planning board?
Sure. I understand the spirit that we're talking about. And I also support the notion of putting the language in writing in the redevelopment agreement and doing both. And the language we're talking about is the ballroom language, correct?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things that we need to hash out. There's the ballroom, yeah. The issue of what kind of events would be held
sort
there.
of keeping a running list of things that I would like to see in the redevelopment agreement.
I believe there are no ballrooms. It's a banquet.
Yeah, they call it a banquet room. But specifically the Restoration Hardware redevelopment agreement stated that there will be no weddings at Restoration Hardware. Correct. And that was something that was put in the redevelopment agreement. And that is our intent, just so everybody understands. That is our intent. We hear the public that no events like that will be allowed. And that will be part of the redevelopment agreement, even though that's not in the redevelopment plan.
Yes.
And the public can hold us to that.
The redevelopment agreement, it affects what the decisions at the planning board are.
Yeah.
It is a negotiated document.
Yeah. The redevelopment agreement is a negotiated document, Mr. Quinn reminds everybody. And yeah, it doesn't just happen. There's a lot of back and forth that goes into that agreement.
Just to clarify a point, Mr. Mayor, this is Peter.
Yes, Mr. Mancuso, go ahead.
This goes, can you hear me? If this
yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. If this goes to the TCC and then back to the planning board for revisions, I just think the public needs to know that it does not come back to the township committee. In other words, our vote on this, whenever that happens to be, is our bite at the apple. Is that correct?
Well, there is one thing that comes back to the township committee, which is the redevelopment agreement. So we will have to vote on the redevelopment agreement. And once the redevelopment agreement is completed, correct, Mr. Quinn, only then will it then proceed to the next stage.
It would only come back to the governing body if there was a request to change the redevelopment plan, and you had to do another hearing to reconsider any changes to the redevelopment plan at a later date.
Okay. So Mr. Quinn just clarified that you are correct, Mr. Mancuso, it would not come back to us after the redevelopment agreement is in place. It would not come back to us unless, Mr. Quinn pointed out, there was a request once it got to the TCC or the planning board for a change to the redevelopment agreement. And if a change was requested, we'd have another hearing, correct?
Yeah, the redevelopment plan, sir.
Yeah, the redevelopment plan, we'd have another hearing.
We'd have to have another hearing.
Yeah, we'd have to have another hearing. Okay. So it's very unlikely it will come back to us. You are correct.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Ravis, go ahead.
I have a comment. I'm listening to, ballroom versus banquet room definition. And I'm hearing that you and Committeewoman Wilson, can put bounds, once it gets to the planning board. But I'm a little concerned that, what we'd be left with, after putting all these bounds on a business, we'd be left with nothing more than a glorified dormitory. And I'm a little concerned that kind of business wouldn't be viable or wouldn't be something that would be interesting to any operator of such a facility. So I understand, that we want to assure residents that, these kinds of activities wouldn't be taking place. But when push comes to shove, we're basically saying, well, it's not really much of a hotel. It's, more of a dormitory with meeting space. So, that kind of worries me that we're heading down into a rabbit hole of a lot of back and forth, and it's gonna lead us down a bad path. Mm-hmm. My comments.
Yep. And just to reiterate what I said a few minutes ago, the redevelopment agreement where this would fall is a negotiated agreement. So the developer would have to agree to everything that goes into that document. So right. I'm sure that we have our interests at stake and they have their interests at stake.
Mayor,
we always try to find a win-win solution.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I have a couple of questions.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on the question that Ms. Lennon brought up about subdividing the lot. And so a couple of questions about that. Currently, it's one lot, which includes the office building, and the hotel would be built on that same lot if this was approved, correct?
Yes, it's one lot right now.
One lot, okay. And that whichever company develops the hotel, that would not be Onyx, correct?
I'm going to say most likely not, but I don't
Yeah.
Well,
That's certain.
The redevelopment plan doesn't say who it has to be. It just provides for the uses and the standards. Sure. So theoretically, they could develop it, but more than likely that they're going to basically come to some agreement with a hotel chain that's going to build a hotel, and that depending upon the financial arrangements and consideration, they may want to sell that off to the hotel user, which is why there's provision for subdivision in the redevelopment plan.
Okay. And
but is that? But is sorry, I had a follow-up question. Go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you. So whichever hotel, the choice of hotel is not up to us at all, correct? It's only up to Onyx. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, the way this will work is that if you approve the plan, you know, at some point, if there is interest, there will be a hotel user looking to develop that particular property. They will come to some kind of arrangement with Onyx or whoever the property owner is. And again, depending upon who's in charge, either entity would appear before the planning board or both to present the case. And obviously the property owner is going to respond to the who that hotel developer is, and as of this evening, we don't know who that's going to be. So we're just going to have to wait and see who an applicant may be for the hotel. The redevelopment plan is just set up to provide the parameters for an applicant to come forward and conform to all the requirements and standards in the plan.
Correct. And we have no say whatsoever in which hotel might choose to submit an application.
No different, Kathy, that in a retail zone that allows restaurant, that you could say it has to be a Ruth Chris as opposed to something else.
Mm-hmm. Okay. To me, that's an important point, and I just wanted to clarify that for the record. And I guess that's it for now. Thank you.
Great. So I have a couple follow-up questions based on what Committeewoman Wilson just asked. And those are regarding, and I thank Mr. Goldberg for bringing up that subdivision provision in the agreement. Can the subdivision occur before the hotel is built, or is there a provision there that says the hotel must be built first?
The way the language is structured in the redevelopment plan is that the subdivision can occur before the hotel is built, and there's nothing that would preclude the subdivision from occurring after the hotel is built.
Is there something that we can put in, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Carlson, is there something that we can put into the redevelopment agreement that brings a little bit more clarity to the Township Committee about the hotel before we go too far down the road?
Sure, sure. You could do that. The redevelopment agreement, you're not obligated to enter into a redevelopment agreement with any developer at all. So that is an opportunity to negotiate provisions, details such as that you might want to see included or enforced.
Okay.
Can you clarify like what details you're talking about there, Mr. Carlson?
That's a kind of a tough question because I don't know what you couldn't ask of a developer. You know, so once the redevelopment plan is in place, presumably it will be attractive to one or more developers. You'll select one of those developers, and then you get to enter into an agreement with them, including what the parameters may be. Now, I would say that they probably can't conflict with the redevelopment plan. And that's probably really the only limit on what you can and can't do in an agreement.
So what this is getting at, Mr. Carlson, is that the Township Committee has great concern. I think all of us, I think I speak for all of us, is concerned about which hotel is actually going to come into our town. And, you know, we've heard that it's going to be a business style hotel, but doesn't have to be. So, and no disrespect to Holiday Inn, because Holiday Inn plays a very important role in the economy of our country, and there's a need for Holiday Inns in many places in our country. But that's not something we want in Morris Township. And we want to make sure that whatever hotel goes in there, meets the standards of our municipality. If a hotel were to go in there, such a hotel would meet the standards of what we want to see for our community, and meets the standards of the business community. And I think that if they can subdivide off the lot before a hotel chain is named, quite frankly, is, I think, a little problematic. And I think it's probably problematic for all five of us not having that clarity. So it gets back to that redevelopment agreement. Can we put in the redevelopment agreement that it must be a name the chains, or be similar to these kinds of chains of hotels that would be acceptable? Is that something we could put in the redevelopment agreement?
You might have some difficulty, and I'm not saying you certainly can't, but you might have some difficulty putting in the redevelopment agreement only selected brands, if you will, or companies that could possibly do it. You certainly could put in standards as to quality that you would require anyone to meet. What I think may turn up, though, is that that might be difficult to define in practice.
Mm-hmm.
But I could certainly look into that question for the committee and get a more complete and formal answer.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's clear that this committee needs more information and wants some greater I don't know what the right word is, understanding of what's going to go into that property.
Sure. Okay. Let me take I'll take a deep dive into the law on that topic, and and then we can have a more robust discussion at the next meeting.
Very good. So, just so the public understands, we have certain quality standards just as our community does. So we want to make sure that what goes there is right for our town. Okay. So any other questions before we move on to the other residents who have their hands raised? Okay, so let's move on. Who's next in line?
Miss Mead, please.
Miss Mead. Michelle Mead, can you unmute yourself?
Good evening, Township Committee members. Thank you very much. Actually,
can you state your address for the record, your name and address?
Michelle Mead, 39 Frederick Place.
Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to take off on part of the discussion that the township.
Sorry, Michelle. Sorry, Michelle. Let me interrupt you. Do you want to stay on audio, or would you like to be moved up to be a video participant?
This is fine.
Okay, very good. Proceed.
Thank you. My question revolves around a topic that you all just discussed, so it's actually good timing. The redevelopment plan is not a negotiated document, although you can negotiate with potential developers around a redevelopment plan, but it's not a negotiated plan. It is something that is imposed by the members of the governing body. Any developer doesn't need to agree to the terms of the redevelopment plan. However, as you've all noted a couple of times in this most recent conversation, the redevelopment agreement is a negotiated document. It is something that not only the township has to agree to, but the developer has to agree to. So there's nothing, while I appreciate the idea that that is a very powerful document that can contain other protections and things that the township may want to include that may also satisfy the residents, we don't know that those things will be agreed to by a developer. So that's where I'm kind of wanting to raise some of my questions and concerns, is the fact that that's not really a protection for the residents at this point, because we don't know if the developer will agree to those conditions that the township committee would like to impart. So that leads me to a couple of things. One is that the existing buffer, Mayor, you mentioned this in response to one of the concerns earlier, that there was no existing buffer per se required for the 340 building, because I know that the resolutions that have authorized that construction do not include any particular thing. However, there is a 40-foot quote unquote buffer that does exist that has not been maintained, and we know that there was no requirement to maintain, and we're hopeful that the developer will do that. So the fact that that buffer does exist, to me, doesn't negate the fact that that buffer exists as a buffer to the existing building. That buffer was not meant to also be a buffer for anything else on that site. So this is a point that I did make at the last meeting, that I don't think the redevelopment agreement is, the redevelopment plan is quite clear about, is the fact that any buffering, in my mind, should not include the existing buffer. So the original development of that site did not include a hotel. And therefore, if you're adding something new to the site, especially with the extent of the building, 4 stories, 130,000 square feet, that additional buffering is required. Whereas the current redevelopment plan makes mention of the fact that the buffering for a hotel could include the existing buffering. So I'm asking that the Township Committee change that to make sure that the redevelopment plan includes a new buffer for the hotel, and the existing buffer continues in its, hopefully in its future maintained state that the developer will agree to. Second of all, with regard to the buffer, and here's again where I think that there's maybe not enough direction to the planning board, is if the redevelopment plan is very explicit on some factors, the planning board has to make sure that the development meets those standards. However, where there is not specificity in the redevelopment plan, the planning board has the latitude to make its own judgment on that. And the width of a buffer for the hotel is something that I would like to see the Township Committee put some parameters on. Right now, they could establish, the planning board could say 1 row of trees planted 50 feet apart is an adequate buffer. I don't think the Township Committee would be pleased with that result, but they could do that. The planning board would have the latitude to do that right now, because there's not enough specificity with regard to what that buffer should be, how wide it should be. And I'm asking for the Township Committee to consider changing the language with regard to the buffer in those 2 respects.
30 seconds, Ms. Mead.
Okay, just a couple of other things. The plan says that the hotel roof mass may be broken up with towers, steeples, pediments, etc., creating an even taller structure than 4 stories. That's of concern. That's one of the things that happened at the 340 building. 4 stories, 350 feet away is quite close when you're adjacent to this property. And, again, ask for consideration that there be some limitations on the height of this vis-a-vis, other architectural elements adding to the plan itself. So I'll leave my comments there for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just ask you for one point. What's that?
Right at 5 minutes.
Right on the nose on this meeting. Let me ask you one question for clarification. Your very first point, you talked about a secondary buffer. Is it your thought that a secondary buffer would be adjacent to the existing buffer, or a secondary buffer that's adjacent to the hotel?
I think, first of all, I don't think there's a lot of room adjacent to the existing buffer, because the existing buffer borders on the detention basin, so that there really isn't sufficient room there, at least at the part that's directly behind my house and some of my neighbors' houses. So I think the secondary buffer would need to be closer to the hotel.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think I can answer that question, or help shed some light on that, because I did talk to the neighbors and did take a close look at the detention basin. I'm sorry, this is Jim Slate, just for everyone's, so where who's talking here, since I'm not on the camera, but I looked at the far side of the detention basin and it slopes down right from the parking lot, but I think there's the opportunity to do a berm there. You have the potential to lose some storage, but I think that storage can be made up on, I'll say, the east side or the 287 side of the detention basin, and the ability to construct a berm at that location. We talked about a fence to help shield parking lot lights or cars headlights. And I think that there's the ability to do planting, and I would suggest something along the lines of, 10 to 12 foot trees staggered on either side of the fence. So a combination of a fence that, serves as, an instant 6-foot buffer, but then also some oversized evergreen trees. And all this along the far side of the detention basin, with some berming, I think would really, go a long way to help provide a buffer. Just to kind of expand on that, because there's been a lot of discussion, and I did take a close look at that to see, what could be done and, how to have a decent buffer and where that buffer could go. Because as Michelle mentioned, that existing buffer, especially near the detention basin, it's kind of the embankment for the berm. And if you start putting trees on that, they're lower and they don't serve much purpose. But on the far side of the detention basin, away from the residents, you do have the ability to do some berming and buffering over there that I think would, be a pretty decent buffer.
Great. And just so all the committee members have the right picture of what the existing buffer looks like, can you explain it a little bit more? So there's a detention basin that runs through. There's some kind of, I don't know, water channel that runs through the buffer right now. Can you also tell us who owns it? Is it partially on residential property? Is there an easement? How much is on the commercial side?
Well, there's a combination of things, but there's a berm that runs along, I'll say, more of the upper end, say probably for the existing building, it runs down from Mount Kemble Avenue to probably about the midpoint or the atrium of the existing building. There's a fairly good berm there in that area. There's also a 40-foot drainage easement because there's a drainage pipe that comes down from Mount Kemble Avenue. But behind that 40-foot easement is property that's owned by Onyx, and that entire embankment with white pines planted on it is part of the property. And then that berm kind of tapers down from that midpoint of the building as you head down towards the detention base. And then the existing buffer is really, overgrown white pine trees. And then as you get down further to the detention basin, there's a little bit of berm and it serves as the embankment or the dam for the detention basin. And it's planted with white pines. And some of those pines, those white pines tend to lose their lower branches over the years. So it kind of opens up, on the bottom. And we did, some of the neighbors are aware there's some trees that have died and gone down in that area. And, aside from the hotel, this proposal that we're discussing right now for the redevelopment plan, we are talking with the developer on replacing those trees, to help fill in the trees that died. Obviously, you're not, putting a 40-foot pine in, but, something that would be larger than a standard, would be a 6 to 8 foot tree. But again, if we could get a 10 to 12-foot tree in there and replace some of that, dead trees that have died, it's going to help improve that existing buffer. And that's really separate from this proposal. It's really related to the existing building. There's also some vines that are choking out some of the trees that's more up towards Mount Kemble Avenue, and doing some maintenance on that stuff to just get rid of that. And it tends to choke the trees off and kill them, just general maintenance.
Okay. So the buffer and the existing vegetation is on Onyx's property?
Yes.
It's all on Onyx's property?
Yes.
Okay. And the original purpose of the berm is, I'm not sure how high it goes, but was it meant to provide some shielding to the residents?
Yeah, most definitely. Some of it, helps provide, a buffer. It's it's probably, a good 8 feet tall, but then it does taper down. And as you get to the lower end, part of that berm, maybe 4 or 5 feet tall, it's the embankment for the detention basin.
So would there be a benefit to continuing that 8-foot height for the berm? Is it possible?
No, because then you would lose all the vegetation that exists on there. You'd essentially kill those trees because you would choke them off.
Yeah. Okay. So sorry for that. So you clearly have an idea of what should go in there, right? As what would be an appropriate buffer.
Yeah, I have a pretty good idea as to, I think what would serve as a pretty decent buffer.
Right. And so those, just as we did with the restoration hardware, when we talked about what an appropriate buffer would be, that was written into the redevelopment agreement. your idea for what an appropriate buffer would be would go into the redevelopment agreement, and it would be agreed to by the developer.
Yeah.
And so just to get back to Ms. Mead's point about what's left to the planning board and what's going to be taken care of here, the Township Committee, I can't say it more strongly that the buffering to the residents is just so hugely important to all of us. And having clarity on that is a must for this to go forward. So Mr. Slate has an idea of what the buffering should be, and that will not be left up to the planning board. That would be taken care of in the redevelopment agreement so that everybody had clarity before it moved beyond control of the Township Committee.
And that was a major point with our meeting.
That was a major point
with our meeting with the contiguous neighbors.
Yeah, and that was a major point with the contiguous neighbors. So there's been discussions already that started with the contiguous neighbors, and that will continue. And the township is part of those discussions, and it is our full intent to incorporate that into the redevelopment agreement before it leaves the hands of the Township Committee. Ms. Wilson, go ahead.
Yeah, when you say incorporate that into the redevelopment agreement, I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about.
It was Mr. Slate's idea of what an appropriate buffer should be.
Okay.
And that will be agreed upon with the neighbors. Just to be clear, we're not going to decide. We want to hear from the neighbors about what's acceptable to them, and we are going to come to a three-way agreement with the residents, the municipality, and the developer about what is going to satisfy everybody.
And those discussions take place before the planning board site plan meetings.
Oh, those discussions take place before the redevelopment agreement. As I stated, that will be decided before it leaves the hands of this governing body.
Okay, I think that's an important consideration to make sure that we include language about that in the redevelopment agreement.
Absolutely. Like I said, buffering for the neighbors is top of my list.
And just to be clear, there's kind of two different issues there. So there's the buffering that's related to the redevelopment plan, but aside from that, we're working on, trying to reestablish the buffer, even if the redevelopment plan does not advance with the Township Committee, we're still working with the developer or the property owner, Onyx, to, improve the existing buffer for the building.
Yeah. It's in their best interest to be a good neighbor to their neighbors. So, and I think they understand that. Very good. So who's next on the list for questions?
Mr. Daniel Gilmartin.
Mr. Daniel Gilmartin. Mr. Gilmartin, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Your name and address for the record, please.
Daniel Gilmartin, 37 Frederick Place, Morristown, New Jersey.
Very
Morris
good.
Township, technically.
Morris Township, New Jersey, yes. Would you like to be elevated to a panelist so you can utilize video?
No, audio is fine.
Okay, very good. You can proceed.
All right. One of the things I've heard repeatedly from the Township Committee is that a lot of trust in Onyx and a lot of trust in that future things will occur to do the right thing. I used to work for the state of New Jersey and dealt with a lot of contractors and developers. Having worked in there and having worked with, in general, businesses such as Onyx that are shareholder-derived corporations, they're not going to do the right thing unless they're held to it. They're going to do the bare minimum that they can and focus on what's going to be the most profitable for them. And while that's fine for them as a business, it seems kind of concerning that the Township Committee has frequently referred to them as likely to do the right thing. One of the things that was also described was talking about the most permissive based on the current market and models from Onyx. Has the Township Committee engaged outside resources in order to evaluate the actual need and to evaluate the likely usage by the hotel industry in that area, or have you been relying on Onyx's information? I ask because Onyx has a vested interest in not necessarily gaining what's best for the area, but what's best for the property resale value. Additionally, there's been a lot of talk. There was some talk previously about the event venue and about descriptions, but differences between banquet halls and things like that. As noted, the FAQs aren't binding. Having worked in audio and lighting in the past, I can tell you that the difference between a ballroom or a banquet room and either a club space, a rave, small concerts, is simply what equipment is brought in by the group using it. So, as noted, there probably should be codified restrictions as part of the agreement to allow for if this were to proceed. You also talked about the use cases for the hotel and such, and there was a comment on that it sounds like it's becoming a dormitory with meeting space. I'm not sure how many people have traveled internationally or even domestically, but that's generally what business hotels are. They're not designed to be destinations. They're not designed to be resorts. They're designed to be comfortable rooms that are utilized by people who need to be in the area, not a attraction for other visitors to come to. If we're saying that not having a more involved hotel, not having something that's more of a destination makes the use case of the space inviable, why is it being approved in the first place? Along those lines, you're not going to get discussions of quality. You're not going to get a boutique hotel in that space. And I know that there was some discussions about, we already have a Holiday Inn in Morris Township, or we'd want to have a nicer hotel. Again, back to has the Township Committee worked with actual independent industry evaluators to determine what's this likely going to be? I mean, in general, if you're looking at a boutique or luxury hotel, it's going to be in a destination, which, to be blunt, the Mount Kemble Office Park is not. It's going to be something that has, beautiful views or attractive areas. They're justifying this by saying it's a blighted area. If we're saying that, again, does this seem like it's actually matching what they're requesting, or does it seem like they're using that as an excuse while pushing for something that they can leverage for higher profit later? On the buffer, I grew up at 37 Frederick Place. It absolutely, on any redevelopment plan has to include a requirement for maintenance and upkeep and replacement of items there, along with some actual consequences that will actually have teeth for the committee. Otherwise, they will have no incentive to do it. They will have the incentive to do it when they're initially building it, and then going forward, they're going to say, well, it's a little too much for our profit margins. So what avenues does the township have for enforcing that later on? And one of the last item was, we also heard some things about, well, we sit on the planning board so we can ensure this. That's not a guaranteed. I mean, that's just kicking the can down the road. The people aren't guaranteed to get reelected. People aren't guaranteed to be reappointed. If this got approved and later on they take 2, 3, 4 years to bring it to the planning board, and it's a new board at that point, what's to stop them from doing the exact things that are concerns that even the township committee has today? If we're relying on the planning board or we're relying on future decisions to be made, it's not a good guarantee for the residents in that case. Additionally, one last item is, if this is built, this is definitively going to impact property values in the area. Since generally property reevaluations and reassessments aren't done on a regular basis, for multiple reasons, including the cost to the township, has there been consideration of including a requirement for Onyx or whoever the developer is to provide the costs for the township to do reassessments of those impacted properties in order to lower the tax burden that they're paying to the township? That's it. I yield the rest of my time.
Can you repeat that last question about reassessments?
Yes. So the last question on reassessments is that since this is, this is basically guaranteed to impact property values in the area, has there been a consideration of knowing that and knowing that there'll need to be reassessments on those properties, having Onyx have to foot the bill for paying for the assessors to reevaluate all of the neighboring properties in order to immediately reduce the tax burden on the residents and property owners who do now have a lower value property?
Okay, very good. Thank you. And your point is very well taken, Mr. Go-Martin, that membership on the planning board is by appointment and membership can change. So that is very true. Okay, next person on the list.
Annalise Rush.
Annalise
Rush. Annalise Rush.
Hi. Annalise
hello,
Rush.
we can hear. Can you state your address for the record?
Yes, Annalise Rush, 10 Frederick Place in Morris Township.
Great. And Mrs. Rush, would you like to be elevated to the panel so we can use video, or are you satisfied with audio?
Audio's terrific.
Very good.
So I just have one brief question, and I apologize. I'm not sure if one of the former residents, Ms. Mead, covered this, but I feel like she may have, but I want to be sure. In multiple instances this evening, you, Mr. Grazel, as well as other officers, have talked about how certain items could be designated for the redevelopment committee, right? For example, is that not, I mean, what is it? Not the redevelopment committee, the redevelopment
agreement?
Agreement, yeah.
Right, so yeah, so we're voting on the redevelopment plan, but the next stage would be the redevelopment agreement.
Committee. But it seems to me like multiple points have been designated for that later redevelopment agreement. For example, the size, location, and even the type of buffer, the type of events that might be held in the ballroom, the timing of these events, the brand of the hotel. There's a very long list of things that many of you have said, well, that's more for the redevelopment agreement. My concern is, and I apologize if this was addressed, what if the plan is approved, the redevelopment plan is approved with this long list of contingencies, and then when it gets time to try and propose this agreement with the developer, there are too many contingencies, and then a lot of concessions are made on your part, or maybe not enough on their part, and then the situation might be, the whole thing might be stymied.
Very good. Do you have any additional questions?
No, that was it. I mean, does that make sense? And was that already answered?
No, it hasn't been asked, and it does make complete sense. So thank you for that. The township does have experience with this process, thankfully, because we did it with Restoration Hardware last year. And when we came out of the redevelopment process, and Mr. Quinn, you can correct me on this, we had a long list of things that the township committee agreed upon that would go into the development agreement. So coming out of the hearing, when we took a final vote, we also went through the list at that meeting of the specific items that would be included in the redevelopment agreement. So that was understood by all the township committee members before we took the vote on the redevelopment plan, if that makes sense. So we knew ahead of time what we all agreed upon would go into the agreement in order for us to take a vote on the plan. Mr. Quinn, is the redevelopment agreement with Restoration Hardware? It must be on the municipal website.
We put all the documents. It probably most likely, like, I will double during the next.
You know what I'm gonna ask our webmaster to do. You can put this on the list. Is put the redevelopment agreement from Restoration Hardware on the redevelopment page with the other documents from Restoration Hardware, and so that residents can go in and see for themselves what was in the redevelopment plan for Restoration Hardware and what was in the redevelopment agreement for Restoration Hardware, so that we have this living example right in our town of what an agreement looks like. Mm-hmm. And it would give the public the opportunity to examine that agreement, compare it to the plan, and see all the additional details that we included in that agreement. I think that would be very helpful for everybody.
Mayor, those documents are on the township website. Yeah. On the land use information page, go to redevelopment, where you have a list of redevelopment activity. At the bottom is the Abbey/Alnwick Hall, which is the Restoration Hardware project, and at the bottom of that is the redevelopment agreement.
Okay, so it's already there. So I urge, thank you, Mrs. Rush, for that comment, because it spurs this conversation. And I will recommend to everybody in the public to go to morristwp.com. At the top, you go to departments. I've done this a lot of times. Then you click on land use, and under land use, you click on redevelopment. So it's a number of steps. So again, you go to morristwp.com, click on departments, then click on land use, then click on redevelopment. scroll down to the bottom of the page for the section on restoration hardware, Madison Avenue, the Abbey, and you will see both the agreements and the plan, and you can see what we did there.
Mayor, are we able to message the participants just to send them the link through Zoom? Is that a capability? Are we able to message the participants, like if we wanted to send them the link?
Yeah, I don't think
through
there's
Zoom.
Chat's not. We don't have. Yeah, we don't have chat. We don't have chat set up.
Got it.
So
Yeah.
then a follow-up question would be, you mentioned earlier, someone asked a question earlier that, you know, different members of the Township Council might, their terms might end or what have you. So would all these elements that would be part of the redevelopment agreement, are they all going to go on the record if and when the plan is approved, so that no matter who is still on the committee, that they would have access to that information and it would be the same static number of contingencies?
It would go to the planning board at the appropriate time.
It would get
the redevelopment agreement along with the redevelopment plan.
No, but what Mrs. Rush is saying is if the redevelopment plan were to occur, let's say in November, if this hearing went to November and then the agreement didn't get signed till February and a member of the Township Committee were to change, would the redevelopment agreement still look the same? The answer would be yes, I would say, because it will be of the public record. Like I said, we are going to write down everything that we all want in the agreement before we vote. And that's going to be part of the public record. And quite frankly, the Township Committee should be held to what they agreed to in the public record. So
again, it has to be negotiated.
Yes, but it has to be negotiated. Right. Yeah. So we can say what we want. We still then have to go through negotiations, step and get agreement. But I think the answer to your question is yes, that would carry over because it is part of the public record.
Thank you.
Thank you for that very good question. Who's next on the list?
For round two, we had Mr. Gustafson still on?
Yeah, we just answered.
Mr. Gustafson was on for round two.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'm here if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, hey, thanks very much. Just a quick observation on the last point about the Abbey plan.
Sorry, sir, I have to ask you for your name and address again for the record.
Oh, sure, I haven't moved. Ken Gustafson, 4 Norwood Court, Morris Township. Thank you.
Very good. And would you like to be elevated to use video?
No, audio is fine.
Very good. You can proceed then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just I was clicking here on my other screen looking at the Abbey plan, and certainly don't have time to get into it now. But one thing I did notice going to the township site is that there is both an Abbey redevelopment plan, and then there is a final amended Abbey redevelopment plan, not agreement. So that's interesting to me because that shows me that there was a plan and there was a change to. And the reason that's interesting to me is that what it sounds like, and one of the previous speakers was following the same point, is that it sounds like what the committee wants to do is say, don't worry about anything. All the details that the residents are worried about will be taken care of at the agreement phase. And I think that's kicking the can down the road. There are at least a dozen parameters here that have been in the redevelopment plan been put at the maximum level to benefit Onyx, whether it's the number of rooms or the crowded parking or the maximum seating in the restaurant or the subdivision that's allowed or the distance of the setback. They have all been set at the maximum parameter that will benefit Onyx and certainly will give them a stronger position to negotiate from during the redevelopment agreement phase. So what I, again, don't understand is why the Township Committee cannot, as it seems like maybe they did with the Abbey, say we're going to amend the redevelopment plan to pare down on some of those maximum parameters, to say, well, why should the maximum room size be what it is? We know that the Archer Hotel, for example, only has 161 rooms in it. So why did Mr. Phillips pick the maximum of the possible comparables that were presented and give Onyx the availability to go up to that maximum level? It doesn't make sense to me. And the Township Committee can do something about that, knowing that the residents are concerned about all these things that are turned up to the max. A final point on that is the the superficiality of the label around ballroom or conference room or boardroom or whatever you want to call it. Because we know that Onyx, in the comparables they presented, used the word ballroom. And that was assigned in the redevelopment plan in the original draft with the word ballroom. And members of the township committee said, without asking to change the capacity or the dimensions or anything restricting the use of that space, simply said, can we not use the word ballroom? Can we call it conference room? And we call it banquet room? That's cosmetic. To a point of the previous speaker, that doesn't restrict the use. If they decide to use it for a ball or a party or a concert or whatever they want to, it doesn't matter what it's called. So I don't understand why the township committee, in hearing all the concerns of the residents against the interests of Onyx, won't try to reflect some of these things in a revised or amended redevelopment plan to, at a minimum, just set down what the maximum limits of what Onyx will, we know, try to get away with. The township committee has that opportunity to do it, and it would be a disappointment if it simply kicks it down, crossing their fingers, hoping that we can work it out at the agreement phase. Thank you.
Thank you. And just for clarity of the record, since it was referenced that there was a Abbey redevelopment plan and then an amended redevelopment plan, please correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Quinn or Mr. Carlson, but we had the original proposal for the Abbey, which was the original plan. There were some slight minor modifications, which were not substantial enough to have to reintroduce the plan. And we incorporated those into the plan and republished that in a final version. Is that correct?
You are correct, sir. They were very minor.
There are also all minor changes, which is why you saw a second document there that we put up on the website. So you had the original and the final. So let me turn this over to Mr. Phillips. We heard from Mr. Gil Martin and Mr. Gustafson. We had a conversation in between with Mrs. Rush. But if you could comment on Mr. Gil Martin and Mr. Gustafson.
Yeah, I also just want to address one issue that Ms. Mead brought up. I know Jim, I think, adequately addressed the issue of the buffer and the intent of the plan. I would just add that it's not the intent of the plan. And I think the language is pretty clear that the hotel should not rely on the existing buffer. I think that's clear in the plan. I won't belabor that. But there was an issue raised about the height. And I think referencing some of the design standards to help articulate building, but essentially the height limit is 50 feet no matter how the hotel building is designed. So those references to changing height along the facade, but it doesn't mean you can go above 50 feet. I just wanted to make that clear. Mr. Gil Martin's comments about the township committee, have they evaluated the hotel market need? I think the short answer to that is no, and we've kind of addressed that on a number of occasions. I think he, as well as Mr. Gustafson, had indicated that there should be additional restrictions. I think Mr. Gil Martin indicated committee, we've discussed that the ability to do that.
Paul, sorry, you cut out for about 10 seconds there. Can you just back up 10 seconds and repeat yourself?
Sure. So about additional restrictions in the redevelopment agreement, I guess it intended to afford protections to residents. We've discussed this on a number of occasions. That's certainly up to and within the ability of the township committee, and there's been discussion about that this evening. There was a specific reference to the maintenance upkeep of the buffer. I would only add, in addition to language to that effect in the redevelopment agreement, that certainly that would be an issue that would come up during the time of planning board approval, and that also could be subject to a condition of the planning board approval. The issue of the impact on property values, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. I wouldn't agree that there's going to be an impact. I don't think anyone knows whether there's going to be an impact. And this issue of the reassessment and footing the bill, that's sort of, I've never heard that. And it's also beyond my expertise, so I'm not going to comment on that. Ms. Rush, I think, Jeff, you addressed her as, again, assurances of issues that the residents have being addressed in the redevelopment agreement if the redevelopment plan is approved. And I think your reference to what was done in terms of the Abbey and encouraging people to see that agreement, I think addressed that issue. Mr. Gustafson, I think his point is work things out before the redevelopment agreement in the redevelopment plan. I think we've discussed that on a number of occasions. That's up to the Township Committee. Just echo, we never amended the Abbey redevelopment plan. Basically, we made some tweaks that were not considered substantial in nature to have to go back to a first reading, or the plan is the plan. It's never been amended.
Okay. Very good.
Mayor, that would appear to conclude round two. We do have one resident who has already spoken round one and round two. Waiting, but
Mrs. Gilmartin?
Yes, she already spoke rounds 1 and 2, and there's Mr. Simon on, but he's already spoken. People that he is representing have also spoken.
Right. So let me say, Rosemary, Mrs. Gilmartin is adjacent to the property. I want to give her a chance. She only asked about 2 minutes worth of questions. So I'm going to recognize Mrs. Gilmartin. You have 3 minutes remaining of your question time. Oh. Hold on 1 second. And then Rosemary. Bud, if you can hear me, can you give me a thumbs up?
Mr. Mancuso just texted me. Let me check.
Mr. Ravitz, if you can hear me, can you give me a thumbs up? He can't hear me.
No.
They're all muted.
But if they can raise their hand, if they can hear us.
Paul Phillips, can you hear me? Paul Phillips? He doesn't look like he can hear me either.
Kathy, can you hear Jeff or me?
Yes,
Kathy,
I can. I can hear both Jeff and Mark Daly.
Okay. And Pete, let's make sure, Peter, can you hear everything? Bud Ravitz, can you hear everything? Yes, give me a thumbs up, Bud, if you can hear me.
No, they're not on. They're not on this.
Why would Committeeman Wilson be on, but not the others?
Okay. Looks like the whole committee's back on, including Tim.
Okay, very good. Okay, so Ms. McDonald, can you please take a roll call, please, and then we'll talk about what's going to happen.
Mr. Durfee?
Here.
Mr. Mancuso?
Here.
Mr. Ravitz?
Here.
Mrs. Wilson? Mrs. Wilson?
Sorry, I was muted. I'm here.
Mayor Griselle?
Here. So just to explain what happened, and I apologize, we lost internet for a second here. We had a little bit of low bandwidth, and then it was gone and it shut down the meeting. So we had to reboot. And because of that, we are going to call it a night. Because we can't assure that everybody who was on previously is back on. We are going to stop the meeting for tonight. We are going to continue the meeting on June 14th. We're announcing a continuation date, but I think we are going to go ahead and renotice everybody to ensure that everybody knows that there is going to be a continuing meeting on June 14th. I apologize to everybody. I apologize to the residents and Mr. Simon. I know Mr. Steck was supposed to present tonight. And I am hoping that June 14th is not a problem for everybody, but I don't think that we can continue at this point. Mr. Carlson, would you have anything to add?
No, I think that's the correct course of action. Let's announce tonight that the meeting is carried for everybody that's here. We'll continue this at June 14th without further notice. We will make sure that word of that gets out on all of our platforms, including the municipal messenger and the website. And yeah, that's all.
And there's still sufficient time to actually do a mailed notice, correct? No?
We're not required to do that.
We're not required to do a mailed notice? Okay.
Okay. I make a motion, we adjourn.
So yes, you're making the motion to adjourn to June 14th at 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock, yes, sir.
Right? Does everybody, I also want to get agreement from everybody on the Township Committee that they are available at 6 o'clock on June 14th.
Yes.
Yes.
Very good.
June 14 is
a Monday.
Excellent.
Very good. So we have a motion on the table to carry this meeting to June 14th at 6 p.m. Can I have a second, please?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, very good. Okay, one last apology again on the record to the public for what's happened tonight. And we will see everybody back on June 14th. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Dawn.